Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And now for the big one, the top 100 best albums of the 2010s. And we're finally here. The project I've been working on for months, and one that I long thought I would either never do nor finish on time, especially given how many more albums I have reviewed this year. And while I could go on about the hundreds of hours of work, comfortably over 1,000 albums that I've heard, probably closer to 2,000, and the additional re-listens required for contemplation and context and ordering, you probably don't care that much about all that, especially given how late this video is regardless, but there are some points of context that need to be established in comparison with the best and worst hits list from the 2010s. Namely that an album is a much different beast in comparison with a single song, for good and for ill. Now, for one, I normally settle on opinions on projects much more strongly. As a composite work, there are just more factors to lay down roots, and examining the larger work, that means that my opinions don't tend to fluctuate that much in the same way, which in theory would make a list like this so much easier. You know what you love, just figure out the order, except for the fact that I didn't start publishing album reviews on YouTube until 2013, and even then I only started writing about albums on my blog back in 2012. That leaves a few entire years where I had to go back and ensure that I wasn't missing anything. And side note, my god, 2010 was a bad year for music, but that's neither here nor there. And then I realized that while I was listening more throughout 2013 to 2015, I hadn't always tapped outside of some specific wheelhouses in terms of genre. I only really got into black metal in 2015, so I had to factor some of that into my exploration too. And then came the really horrifying thought that every year you inevitably miss out on something because there's just not enough hours in the day to hear every single scrap of music that's released. And before I lost my mind trying to cover all my tracks, I put everything back into perspective and I had to step back. Inevitably, over 10 years and with such a varied list, you're gonna miss something. Every critic does. It's a fact of life. Don't get that agitated about it. But that also raises another point that will be contentious. What is commonly perceived by the critical establishment as great doesn't always align with my own taste. And well, of course, taste is a social construct and art criticism is subjective, and it shouldn't be invalidating for me to come up here and say Kanye West is not on this list, but Kesha is. I know some people, they will object to certain projects that are missing, or the fact that I'm praising stuff that wouldn't normally get the same sort of establishment attention or the larger cultural apparatus. And you know what? Well, that shouldn't matter. Ultimately, I'm sticking with the material that resonated with me the most. And given that we're examining a decade, which was a full third of my life, some of that has evolved and changed, and that's pretty much true for everyone if they're being honest with themselves. I also know that because I got a platform, it is making a statement that I'm including these albums in this order on this list. And as such, I'm fully aware this will not match anyone else's list. It's all about my opinion, which is true about all my reviews, no matter how impassioned I get. It's subjective at the end of the day. And while I can defend all of this, I do stress you don't need to take it all that seriously. There are bigger things in the world than a long overdue list right now, especially when the placement of some of these albums is tied to emotional experiences that I've had that are unique to me. And I'm not going to invalidate those experiences under some feigned attempt at compensating for bias that we and society at large all have. That being said, to cover my bases, I did excavate as many old lists of best albums of various respective years just to hear them, from mainstream critics, indie outlets, genre-specific sites, and even down to certain contributors to Rate Your Music and YouTube. And while I observed way more common ground than I think that some people want to admit, I did do my due diligence in making this list here. So alright, with all of that being covered, a couple more pieces of housekeeping before we start in earnest. Number one, I don't think there's any official mixtapes on this list, but there is an EP or two, which is a conscious choice to include because the album structure is, again, largely artificial. There are albums about the same length as some of the songs on or near this list, and if the EP is strong enough to stand against all that, it counts. Number two, while I tend to be a little bit more set in stone surrounding my scores, viewers, do not be surprised if a few projects I may have rated an 8 out of 10 sneak onto the honorable mentions list instead of some 9 out of 10s. Again, I use the scores more as a baseline and bookkeeping measure for me to keep organized around some rather fluid opinions rather than that hard objective measure. Because, again, no such thing as a truly objective opinion in art. Which leads me to my next point. By necessity, I had to take into context how certain projects have aged and changed. So I ran into a very similar issue when I made my best songs of the 2010s. Yes, older albums have had more time to age with me, but they also had more time to deepen their appeal, or perhaps age on me. Yeah, newer projects might be fresher in my mind, but that's no guarantee of placement. And hell, some of the albums from 2010 to even parts of 2013, I checked out for the first time in researching this list. So I'm approaching all these with the ears of somebody in 2020. And if that emotional resonance has persisted for however long, it is valid in how I built this list here. And finally, there is a balancing act in creating any of these lists and how much you want to highlight variety or for praise or just stick for multiple projects from the same act that might have just held up that much more in contrast. So in my opinion, I prefer honesty, so one act might have 2 to 4 albums in the top 100, but for my own personal kicks, I created a side list only picking 1 album per act, and with that narrowed scope, there's a pretty hefty selection of honorable mentions in alphabetical order by artist from Ab-Soul Control System.
Maybe my sovereignty will still be mine if all the gangs in the world unify. We stand a chance against the military tonight. I said we stand a chance against the military tonight.
From Aesop Rock, The Impossible Kid.
We can learn from the ostensibly lost. I think it's funny when defendants from identical haunts step out the tempest to measure of what the spectrum involves.
From Anderson Paak, Malibu.
I might never come down, I might never come down. Never come down. Let me get down. Come on, you never come down. No, let me get down.
From Ariel Pink's Haunted Graffiti, Before Today.
Coming back to the bowl, and when the dance hold them all.
From Bleachers, Strange Desire.
Now it's only you that matters. I will find any way to your wild home.
From Brandy Clark, 12 Stories.
Of October, all while you were hungover.
From Caitlyn Smith, Starfire.
This town is killing me.
From Clipping,
Dead body, right teeth, white knife, sharp getting. If you a bad bitch, let them know you ain't out for the dough. You want twerk some girl, twerk some girl, twerk some girl.
From Cloud Nothing's Attack on Memory. From Daft Punk, Random Accessed Memories.
If love is the answer, you're home. Hold on.
From Daughters, You Won't Get What You Want.
The party's all over.
From Dr. Dre and various artists, Compton.
Feeling that? Fuck with me, come on. You know I'm really that. Fuck with me, come on, come on, come on.
From Fen, Winter. From Ghost, Meliora.
It's like a crime.
From Laura Marling, I speak because
To be
I...
seen and not to be understood.
From Lorde, Melodrama.
Seeing you down every road. I waited for
Marina and the Diamonds, The Family Jewel.
Inside the outsider. Inside the outsider. Inside.
From Panopticon, Kentucky. From the Pistol Annies, Hell on Heels.
I'm hell on heels. Baby, I'm coming for you.
From Pup, Morbid Stuff.
Sitting around and thinking all this morbid stuff. Like if anyone I slept with is dead.
From St. Vincent, Strange Mercy.
Wanna be a cheerleader no more.
From Swans, To Be Kind.
I am no one.
And from With Them Temptation, The Unforgiving. Okay, you got all that? Good, because we're going to be blowing through the bottom 50 pretty fast, maybe a sentence or two apiece. So let's start with... I once described this ambient project as the long unearthed funeral of itself that's eating itself alive. An Ouroboros of dispirited specters glitching as damnation looms. A texture of grief that you can never grasp because you forget its very incidence. And you know, I'm probably not going to be able to top that description because it's one of the most subtly eerie ambient albums you will ever experience. A lot of people haven't heard it. Check it out. Oh look, a legacy hard rock act has nothing left to prove by the 2010s, so they make their most progressive and diverse album of their entire careers, with all the wild, groovy intensity that made them absolute stars in the 1970s. Way too kooky and way too fun for me not to love. She is the Machine, and this album chronicles everything she and the world around her is doing to prove its title wrong. A shot of unstable, heartbreaking momentum into country punk that is sold with some blistering, ragged insight and maybe a few too many bottles of wine. It is something truly special. Yeah, this indie rock band has better taste, writing, grooves, and hooks than they ever got credit, especially in the 2010s. So when the critics started ignoring them proper, they delivered the most maniacally diverse slice of nerdy post-punk revival to date. It was criminally underrated in its brilliance and its kookiness. Absolutely worth hearing.
Act like it's my new best friend tonight. And I cry, and that's how I don't love you anymore.
It seems like if Jamie Johnson wanted to give us just enough original work to call it a career, he would do it with a heavy-set double album, where every single song here feels like a country standard that's waiting to be canonized. It's another album of contemplative, hard living, bellied by some impressively warm production. Hi, Dave Cobb. We'll probably be seeing a lot more of you, and a lot of detail that makes his absence just ache all the harder. But man, what a way to go out.
I
I was always late for the bus, just once can I be on time? Then I start to think, what's the rush? Who wants to be on time?
The Roots take us on a dreamlike, jazzy trip backwards in time where the musings but resigned black everyman feels hazy but familiar, which is the point. The wordplay is impeccable as always, but what has always pulled me back was the populism and the soundscape, with even more delicate splashes of indie rock, but never to the point of obscuring the Roots' dogged unwinding, where you might not even hear that breathless gut punch that's a-coming.
Midnight meets the rain. You've been standing on deep waters.
Of all the Destroyer albums of the 2010s, this is the one that is the most lush, the most layered, but arguably Dan Behar's most and least accessible. Kaput laid a lot of the foundations for Dan Behar to deconstruct his muses, but foundation, that's a word that implies stability, and the noir he plays with shows a level of existential confusion that is supremely captivating and so beautiful all the same. So much deeper than his drama, indeed.
If I make it out alive, I'll call, you know I will. If I can just survive one more night in Jacksonville.
Well, this is the sort of desperate swing for the fences by an indie country band expecting that it was all over after it, and yet filtered through Jason Isbell's production, BJ Barham captured a desperate road warrior mentality that hammered them back on the map. You know what? They may have thought that they were destined to burn out particularly hard after this, but instead, they blazed all the brighter, and they delivered their second classic album.
Well, the only words I said today are beer and thank you.
It's a story of seasons and their sarcastic subversions, and a more sedate listen than his album that came before, but Bill Callahan traced and untangled a love story amidst a broader array of instrumentation and the sort of stark lyrical detail that you almost don't realize this album has some of his best hooks to date. The road might wind around in a lonely circle, but man, it can captivate a dream all the same. Okay, really, this one could have gone to either Kentucky or Roads of the North. I put Kentucky in the honorable mentions a little bit by accident, but honestly, it belongs there too. But the conclusion of this country black metal fusion is one that holds my heart the strongest. The arrangements are more lush and warm, the melodies and production are more refined, and the wild tranquility finally realized amidst all the howling riffs and screams. This was the album that won me over on black metal, and for all that, it's here.
Slang, half a thing of heroin in the bathroom. Keep an AK in the back up in the back room. Cook a meal clean, and she suck me like a vacuum. Took a vacation to the county, I'll be back soon.
Freddie Gibbs has asserted himself with a tremendous potency in the 2010s, but this hits his mastercraft. The lush, organic blend of samples and lo-fi beats from Madlib that push Freddie Gibbs slightly out of his trap comfort zone, but also prove that he's more than capable of becoming the mature and introspective, but also wildly charismatic and entertaining gangster rapper at the core. This is everything that somebody could hope for coming out of gangster rap, and Freddie Gibbs, he knocked it out of the goddamn park. Great project.
Snowflakes on avalanche. Dirty, rotten, filthy scum. For a long while I've known I'm dirty, rotten, filthy scum.
Does this album album make it here because of all the memes, how overstuffed it is with manic, howling color, how Joe Talbot blows gaping holes in toxic masculinity by delivering snowflake oi for the ages, or because it actually is a desperate mission statement for the ages that only proves more frighteningly relevant with every single passing year looking forward? Well, regardless of your reason, this snowflake became an avalanche that the best one that you'll ever let hit you in the face. It's worth it.
'Cause where I'm from, we live by the love, die by the love. We live for the love, die for the love.
Now, this went underappreciated by pretty much everyone upon release, but now 6 years later, everyone's copying the notes that Jhené Aiko laid down, and they still have not caught up. Brilliantly textured and liquid R&B that balances out the sensual with the intensely cerebral, with a level of emotional intelligence balanced out with deceptively simple vulnerability, interweaved around a big movie reference that the vast majority of people never noticed. Her legacy is secured with this, and whatever soul she sold, those returns keep washing in.
Didn't I take you to higher places you can't reach without me? Reach without me.
Quiet mastermind producer behind the XX delivered a tribute to House that is so well textured and expansive that I think I could probably smell the festival within the first couple of songs. It's a sunset splashing over waves of dust and light, the crowd enraptured, and yet in a second you could feel like you are with that someone and no one else. So much intimacy and space set in perfect balance. He set out to make a tribute to this brand of house, and then just wound up as part of the canon.
I'm a proponent of the mainframe hacking. If it wasn't built for me, I'm laying the accent. Break it apart and reconfigure the whole system. Take it to base level demolition of buildings. You can see I ain't rain man, no puppets on me. Pressure what I feel like, what your soul still like, 'cause I'm so free.
Now, this is an album of smoked out hyper-awareness and paranoia, where you can weave through all those systems but feel the weight of every single step. See the flaws of those systems, but know that by exposing their fragility could have some untold consequences, let alone breaking the systems. So the album's title becomes a deflection from every angle and a mantra to stay sane. It's unbelievably clever to the point where I find even more insane detail with every re-listen to this day, but also having way more heart and empathy in the misdirection than they're often given credit. A tangled brilliance, but from these two, Jean Grey and Quelle Chris, could it be anything else?
I'm giving it my all, but I'm not the guy you're taking home. Ooh, I keep dancing on my own.
A decade after her original stateside success, Robyn unleashed her glittery electro-pop opus that might have its dated moments and spots, but is otherwise too insanely catchy, beautifully produced, and sold with impeccable charm for me to care. Robyn is so far ahead of the curve on this album that indie pop is only really starting to catch up now, and you can argue that Dancing on My Own is one of the best pop songs that has ever been written in the history of the genre. I mean, 2010, what pop music could possibly be better?
I'll eat you up.
Yeah, yes. Don't look at me like that. This EP is the moment that Kesha's feral intensity truly ignited. That slapdash party girl is still there and welcome, but she's tempering it with punk abrasion and a ragged queer energy that, despite also having some questionable moments 10 years later, still contains some of her most anthemic songs. Songs from this EP went viral on TikTok this year, and well deserved too. This was Kesha's electro pop at its sharpest, ready to blow it all away.
Step out in the darkness and onto the streets. Forget about the fuss, let's have a carnival feast. Raise up your lowered head and hear the liberation beat, because there never was no God.
In a decade where the whole concept surrounding Britishness arguably deserved a lot more intelligent and informed discourse than it ultimately got, Frank Turner targeted that national identity and history for a good old folk punk deconstruction, and then dig through the rubble to find whatever the hell is worth salvaging. And what we got is Frank Turner's second classic album after Love Iron Song, where the disillusionment will war against desperate optimism to find something worth building and valuing, and you know what? There's just enough to deliver some of his most best produced and most heartfelt songs to date. Rarely has an ex-human felt this triumphant.
If I could build a bridge between us, arcs of soaring rainbows, strength of Mother Earth, would it feel lost?
The band actually survived the pop pivot by making their sound Titanic, where all those little fights have the scale and sweep of Storms on High, where there's such an atmospheric crystalline swell to back up the clear production, and Marco Seresto's huge delivery that calling it pop rock probably sells it short. This is arena rock, music built for a modern coliseum. A departure from alternative metal, sure, but a comfortable niche that was found all the same. But the seeds of those gods were planted a little earlier, and I think we'll get to that soon. Meredith is such an obscenely talented melodic composer with an eye for syncopation and warping time signatures, and so many crescendos that you almost don't notice when she takes a step into indie pop. She finds a lot of the heartfelt hesitation of her genius in her writing and her delivery, and the courage to ride her dizzying waves of brass and synth to the future that will sing to the heartstrings all the same. Plus, she actually confirmed to me personally that yes, she was inspired by Vanessa Carlton on a certain song Air. I mean, her brilliance, her pop sensibilities, they're only just getting tapped, folks. We're in for a ride ahead.
I put the pistol on that poodle and I shot that beat. Run the jewels, 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 jewels,
You know, it says something when your proper prototype, we'll get to the proof of concept in a moment, is so damn strong that it becomes one of the best rap albums of the decade anyway. At this point, LP and Killer Mike, they were only proving their exaggerated and wildly funny banditry could actually work opposite LP's alien synths, but it was one that screamed for all comers in its naked disrespect for the thrones, and yet they saw none dare approach. Tilling, I reckon.
It's the strangest thing.
Adam Granduciel pulls out of the haze of the road and surges down that highway with an even brighter sheen, where the writing remains just as oblique and peeling through a lot of memory, but the waves of synth and the glistening guitar passages makes it sing to the heartstrings regardless. It's very telling that the understanding is ultimately of yourself, where the clarity is more subtext that you know than you can actually speak aloud. And that's powerful.
Telling yourself all you'll ever need is a heart full of fire and gasoline. I could use a little who I was in that way back when. To be young and angry again.
The first of more than a few Lori McKenna entries on this list, this is probably her most maternal and family-oriented project in the 2010s, with the admittedly drier acoustics providing some of that homespun texture, but also accentuating the punches that she refuses to pull. Nostalgia in these stories is tempered with the tough details that you want to forget, but you can't, and the subtext of those scenes overflows in nearly every single line. Again, one of the best songwriters we're working today in any genre, and as I said, more coming on this list. It shouldn't work. Fusing industrial textures, post-punk and noise rock with blues, soul, and gospel, it could have just been a gimmick, but Algiers' self-titled debut takes the fiercely literate but now less intense howls of Franklin James Fisher through a cavernous nightmare of a mix for an album that might as well hold as a Southern Gothic testament, especially with its deceptively brilliant framing device. Coupled with a lot of ragged cries for long-deserved justice for black men, and Algiers, they got a debut for the ages, and one that burns hot and black.
Pussy. I love it more than rapping or eating. I love it more than napping or reading. I love it more than new kicks. I'll be happier in bare feet with a few chicks.
There's a part of me that I'm still surprised that I love this the way I do. A quiet, offbeat, frequently kooky underground hip-hop album from The Observer looking to deconstruct communication and his outsider status, which is a frequent theme in Homeboy Sandman's work, but now across a warm, textured mix that'll burrow into all sorts of weird corners that still have a remarkable amount of quiet heart to them. It also features some of the most hilarious bars that I've heard in hip-hop, and goes down with the sort of tactile witticisms that remain fiercely entertaining to this day. This is an album that is often misunderstood for winding around in its own cleverness, whereas bridging the gap to it, that's part of the point, and it's all the more fiercely rewarding.
I see the sun go down, I see the sun come up, I see a light beyond the frame.
Mike Hadrius is one of the most stunning vocal talents of the 2010s in terms of raw, irresistible charisma and presence. Even in his most brittle moments, he will just command the room, but no shape hits the opulent genius of bridging high delicacy with the unsteady, coursing grooves that have always been his electronic hallmark. Baroque pop, but with texture and real edge. And for an album that's all about dissociative escapism, before having to regretfully return to the dreary world below, but still manage to find a spark of hope, it still manages to soar. Something special.
Because I've seen the other side of power. Yeah, it's a game that can't go on. It can break down any hour. I see the faces and I know them all.
Oh, what do you know? They followed it through. Algiers' sophomore album is the self-titled debut with a steroid and endorphin injection to the base of the spine. The beats will crack louder, the mixes are more chaotic, the politics are a lot more incendiary, and Franklin delivers a tour de force performance that will just command your attention. This is one of those revolutionary projects that only grows more relevant with every single passing year. Music to call strikes, wage protests, and set the roots of systemic racism ablaze. It is titanic, and as of today, it remains their best work. A siren call against all the sirens.
Words across my heart, symbols of infinity, elements so pure, atomic number.
Hey, you know what? I'm still irked that we're only likely going to get the one of these, as between all the beautiful vocal harmonies, how each individual voice and songwriting presence will pull the album down a lot of tangled paths of textured indie folk, while still bringing forth a real synthesis. This is just such a strikingly varied and colorful album, one that lets every single artist shine while amplifying just how well they work together. It might just be more of a compilation of great songs than anything larger, but even then, holds together beautifully all the same. It It took a while to come around on Miguel's brand of R&B, but while many will celebrate Wild Heart as his magnum opus this decade from 2015, this was always the tighter, more liquid and punchy project that proved so infectious and spellbinding for me. And yet it's still smoky, it's still loose, and unquestionably fun without the oversold pretensions. The perfect crux point of Miguel at his very best. No, I'm not quite sure it's got a song as good as Coffee, but as a whole, man, goes down easy. There are more than a few albums on this list where white guys will rend themselves asunder and trying to find focus and relevancy in the modern world where they want to reject a system that will privilege them, but Foxing took that egocentric pomposity and dared to follow through on it, forcing the hard introspection and reckoning with one's role in the modern world going forward that a lot of them would not dare, all with a world-shattering scale to make a lot of that sonic impact stick. Also, Game Shark might be the best song written about the multifaceted hidden nightmare of privilege that was written this decade. If there's no other reason to check out this album, it's that.
All these rappers sound the same, beats sound the same, raps sound the same, wings fan the flames, heat with the fangs, 10 years in our lane, Doomtree, Bangarang.
So, Doomtree Collective projects are on this list multiple times. And I'm saying that while fully emphasizing that POS probably spent many of these years living up to his stage name. He's always been the worst member of Doomtree. I've been saying that for the past decade, now in more ways than one. And there's a part of me that wishes that Doomtree albums would feel less relevant nowadays so I could put some of that out of my mind. But this was the project where all the fractured elegance of the production met the explosive hooks that made this group so anthemic and captivating to begin with. The bangers are stacked deep on this one, and all the more worth it.
This is funk, this is soul, this is gospel, this is sanctified sick, this is player Pentecostal, this is church, barbecue, amen, pulpit, what my people need and the opposite of bullshit.
There is a part of me that going back to this after the fact just felt like it was a trial run for Run the Jewels. This was the proof of concept, especially with LP's production. But the truth is that Killer Mike was going further than that and embracing a lot of the whole Dungeon family swagger and more explicit political tones that will take until Run the Jewels 2 to really pop off. But yeah, this is a bruiser and a multifaceted one. Toes around some certain questionable statements that by this point are almost sadly routine coming from Killer Mike, but keeps the heartfelt core intact with some great snapshots of fun, juxtaposed with a street level insight that crystallizes with Reagan, which might be one of the biggest wallops that he's ever thrown, and some demystification that is direly needed. When Kendrick Lamar implied more folks should be listening to Killer Mike, this was the album he was talking about. No Holds Barred.
I've been living in the fishbowl. Everybody looking, yeah. Looking at the kid go. Doing what they wouldn't, doing what they couldn't not.
Now, this is an album that captures an existential nightmare that comes with taking yourself to the very brink of wild-eyed recklessness in your art, only to realize that the cold world was nudging you along and that you need to be the person to pull yourself back from that brink. Took me a while to realize this, but it is Sims at his best. The wordplay is tighter, the delivery is more intense, the content is so much more visceral, and no jokes, this might be some of his most forward-thinking production ever. When you consider how much a certain very aggro brand of trap would follow in his wake in the past 4 or so years, and still hasn't quite caught up to what he's got here, you've got a slept-on, deeply unsettling rap album that y'all need to hear. Well, check the title. Okay, yes, there is a part of me that is very deeply annoyed that Savages did not spend the rest of this decade delivering blunt, tempestuous post-punk full of thorny, hard-edged feminism and some of the best bass and guitar interplay of this era. But what really threw me is that even after so many years of people doing the whole post-punk revival thing, Jenny Beth and the group behind her, they not only feel relevant, but tapping into this primal, unsettling edge that persists to this day. And given that I've apparently picked up more of a taste for hardcore punk along the way, even the wilder edges that put me off 7 years ago, they now really work for me. This is an album that has only gotten better with time, and while its promise was kind of brief, the statement was implacable.
Oh, bees only swarm when they're looking for a home. So I followed them. I found the bee's nest in the buffalo's chest.
So I was struck between this and Dream River in terms of the stronger Bill Callahan album, until I realized that all the instability and the sense of atmosphere cultivated by the more focused songwriting on this project, it didn't need ornamentation to deliver its understated but no less potent emotions. For a project this low-key and understated to feel as portentous as it does, it's a sign of a master at his craft. And it's a high watermark that somehow is still paying a lot of dividends to this day. I'm not sure that's a good thing, given some of the subject matter here, but hell, I'll take it either way. So yeah, this is a band that somewhat short-circuits something in my brain when it comes to its Celtic flavor and black metal, a little bit more lush than the project that came before it, and outside of a rather underwhelming outro, it might have even surpassed it from the remarkable tunefulness to its poignancy and its wild man environmentalist musings, wondering just how much we can preserve before it's all too late and wiped away. I mean, the next steps, they've got to be coming, folks. Just a matter of time before they get there, but I'll go down these paths in the meantime.
Don't say you're gonna save me, save me, save me. Don't say you're gonna save me, save me, save me. You're not always gonna save me, save me, save me.
I'm still kind of floored to this day. I found this act on Bandcamp by accident. A little-known indie folk act that still has such supple, organic swell, solid falsetto, and a gentle but complicated lyrical arc in examining a lot of how somebody can love and gauge their partner's receptiveness to it. And you know what? Ever since I found it, checking through Spotify, it appears like the majority of traffic they've received has been from my fans. Thanks for that, because this album is a blissful gem that opens up so much for the future, and I can't wait for that potential to be unlocked. And you know what? Speaking of the future, this is what a lot of folks, including me for a long time, considered Janelle Monáe's best project to date, and I get it. The sort of theatrical debut that leaps across genre with aplomb and embraces a layered, Afrofuturist sci-fi landscape that's as enticing as it is fiercely allegorical to both loving in times of crisis and then questions of living up to some impossibly high expectations. And you know what? While it does feel perhaps it might be better on the stage than on record, when a genius like Janelle Monáe can build such a layered and neon-covered world in her blend of soul, funk, R&B, psychedelic rock, and more, oh, that's a play I could live in. Yeah, both the Sayor albums are making this list, if only because while Forgotten Paths showed all the potential for the band going forward, Guardians was an apex point of surging climaxes of tremolo riffs and fantastical dynamics that pulled you into its own wild world just as deeply. Again, the blend of the pipes and the tremolo riffing on the guitars and the strings has such a stirring texture that even though it feels a little colder, it's like the blast of crisp wind stinging across your face as you soar through the air and let forth a barbaric yelp. Panopticon, they might have been the act that got me into black metal, but Sayor was the one that locked me in for more. The word here, stunning. This is an album as much about musing through a wary and a weary comeback as it was proving everybody wrong as one of the most groove-heavy, experimental, and thought-provoking acts working in mainstream alternative rock. But you know what? The better descriptors, they come in desert rock and even more psychedelic rock. There's so much bleak snarl and swagger that even when it gets twisted and kind of off-kilter, you want to keep trudging forward to the ineffable and surprisingly downbeat core and ending. But what always strikes me is how Queens of the Stone Age, they don't wallow in so much of that darkness, even if this might be one of their darker albums. They'll bring the sinuous, crushingly organic grooves to bear and show a band with way more of a flair for experimentation than they were probably given in their time, especially in the 2000s. Let's just hope it's not all downhill from here, as they said. And speaking of a lot of experimentation, this was Sturgill Simpson seeing a major label budget at Atlantic and the opportunity to do it all for himself and going for broke with blaring Muscle Shoals-esque horns, a defiant country rock groove, and the most unexpected but powerful Nirvana cover I think I've heard in years. I mean, it's not worth arguing whether or not this is country so much as it is a tour de force in expanding a sound while preserving a surprisingly grounded emotional core and a family that Sturgill Simpson will clearly cherish more than pretty much everything else, and he'll make his antipathy known to everyone else. As tender as it is witty and occasionally riotous, this forced the world outside of indie country to take notice, if only for a little while, hope for a lot longer.
Just get lost out and all right now. A road to yonder and you notice up the sea. They stand by the good intentions they've in company.
I mean, it's a triple album. It's so filled to the gills with eclectic instrumentation and a lot of fascinating chord progressions, and Joanna Newsom is just gonna take us on that rambunctious, wonderful journey, frankly with a lot more confessional moments across its midsection than I often see are acknowledged or given credit because of this album's pure heft and sense of whimsy. But it's the sort of project that a few sentences I have here to provide detail will never do it justice. It's so organic and colorful with whatever tangled rabbit hole it pulls you in. It's a spell for the better, but it's not just ornamentation either. It's color for her world, and it's one that's so profoundly rewarding even despite its intimidating length. Also makes for a killer album around the holidays, especially on vinyl. Don't ask how I know that. You know, when I coined the label of Dream Country as a subgenre label last year, the album that I always knew would be close to the progenitor of it all, it was this. Made by Devin Townsend from Extreme Metal and Shay Amy Dorval, it's a slice of amazingly textured and hypnotic atmospheric country, full of smoked out, moody swells, and some of the most strikingly blissful production that came out this decade. On sound alone, this album would be making my list list. It's just that unique. The fact that it includes a strikingly abstract story about being stranded on the moon, full of breaking clocks and existential horror, that's just a welcome bonus. Again, one of the most unique albums I think I've ever heard. A countryside project that touches both future and past and winds a misty trail between them and then dares for you to follow. So will you?
Got a second chance, I'm gonna make it count. Make my way out west, maybe head down south. Live a life of a pardoned man, believing in things I don't understand.
This album is an exhale from one of the most quietly brilliant country singer-songwriters that's working today, where after a very hard, morally questionable road, he slows down, takes a step back, takes stock of his life, both reconciling past guilt, but also the very real adult questions that come with looking forward. Jason Eady is one of those older writers that got a knack for the subtle simplicities, the details that don't leap off the page immediately, but you feel in your gut regardless. And while I will not call this his best, it's some of the most pure country you're gonna find in this decade. Refinement by a master.
I like for my shoes to look like they've been walked in, my house to look like it's been lived in, my car to look like a coffin that's been driven off a cliff, my career like a non-stop graveyard shift.
It feels more like a comeback than it actually is. After a flirtation with indie rock in 2010, Sage Francis came back with a beast that will both take and deliver the body blows, and that only picks up more clever intricacy with every single listen. Folks, this is my gold standard when it comes to both emo and rap, especially their combination. Vulnerable and painfully honest in exploring depression, poverty, and uncomfortable relationship angst, but also bruising in remarkably clever ways, coupled with a rich breadth of dark but textured production that reflect an eclectic veteran's presence. This is an album where you will get the very obvious raw punchlines for the quiet ones only to knock you upside the head when you don't notice. And it's easily one of the most slept on rap albums of this decade. You probably haven't heard it, you should.
6-inch heels, she walked in a club like nobody's business. Goddamn, she murdered everybody and I was her witness.
Now, this, on the other hand, is not at all slept on, mostly because of the dangerous audacity from an artist of her stature, and the machine behind her should not really feel as audacious as it does. I stand by this as Beyonce's best album. It tears through genres with aplomb. Beyonce sells the rawness of her pain and fury better than she's ever sold any emotion on record. And not only do the stakes materialize in her fractured marriage, but she must then grapple with what reconciliation as a black woman would look like for her, which is a much more hard and more adult conversation than many would want to admit, especially when your husband is Jay-Z. It's one of the rare albums that can actually take a lot of real-life melodrama and then spin all the artifice into something that can capture the whirlwind while giving enough view of the eye of the storm to keep you coming back. And again, it's her best album. Easily.
Show up first and I'll leave last. You can't tell me shit. You paid to be our opening act. You can't tell me shit. I know that cupping the mic causes feedback, but I'm an MC and this is how the fuck we act. You can't tell me shit. Receipts upon 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 receipts.
You know, I was initially surprised that this album beat out Copper Gone when it came to Sage Francis associated projects, but then I realized I go back to this album way more often, most because it's got so much textured and deliriously fun energy that careens across stories that are both absurd but also frighteningly prescient and relevant. There's a slight screwball edge to some of B. Dolan and Sage Francis's storytelling and production, until you start peeling between the lines and you find the complex self-awareness and commentary on a lot of those situations. The stroke of genius comes in how once you add that complexity, what was supposed to be fun, it actually still remains entertaining. It's a meteor experience, but one I wouldn't disparage for a second. A team up that makes really all the sense in the world, and I can bet will only produce more gold going forward. From a duo this forward thinking, I would expect nothing less.
It's a bad religion.
I can imagine that some people will be surprised that this is as low as it is, and probably more surprised when I say this is Frank Ocean's only entry on this list. No Nostalgia Ultra, no Endless, no Blonde. Now, part of this is because for as much of his albums will sprawl and tangle through the mist, this is the project that captures the expanse the best, while pulling the fewest punches in a lot of its self-aware commentary. It's a luscious album that tangles you in humid opulence and dares you to find the relatable human core in the intoxication, and more often than not, it really does. This is a project that's got the emotional complexity and heft to swallow hours and you won't even notice it, and as such, it is not an album that I will revisit as frequently, outside of Pyramids, and Super Rich Kids, and Pink Matter, and Bad Religion, but you want to know what did wind up on heavy rotation for me?
I've seen the streets you're walking down. I'm fairly local, good people now.
I could just walk away after laying forth this blasphemy, and I think some folks will be satisfied. But the truth is, for me, is that 21 Pilots built an album that went mainstream and then tore itself into paroxysms as a result. A meta album that wound up not only as profoundly influential across multiple genres of pop and rock and rap to this day, but was also stacked to the goddamn gills with so many great hooks that you could be tempted to take it all at face value. Hell, I'd argue it works at face value. It's an album that features the pop refinement that was still not quite there from Vessel, but also all the populism that was thrown aside on Trench. And for me, 21 Pilots at their best. You know what? If Tyler Joseph needed help in all the polarization, guess he could have called me. I'd have delivered.
Alright, I'll make it up tonight. I wanna do all the things that you like, provided you give me time, I'm saying.
There is a part of me that is surprised that this held up as much as it did, but what Emotional Oranges nailed in this pristinely tight and incredibly intricate project, as that length is not going to hold you back if you can pack in this many organic killer grooves, and the sort of storytelling and arc that remains interesting and compelling. I would still argue the interplay of their singers, not just in the vocal arrangements, but the storytelling is their greatest hidden strength, especially when you tack on a fracturing relationship narrative that has way more complexity to its drama than so many people have given credit, and thus the tasteful tacticians of groove to a fault, but with enough hints of messy reality in order to keep them grounded. It's exactly what I love my favorite R&B to be. Also, it slaps. Duh. Well, that's about half of our list. I'm sure I annoyed, angered, and infuriated at least some of you with these picks or some notable absences, but now we're on to the meaty stuff where I will wind up saying a fair bit more. If you need a break, pause the video at your convenience, go grab yourself a beverage, a snack, a plant of your choice, a companion of your choice. I'm not about to judge. Go get ready, have fun. It's gonna go long. Alright, you settled in? Good. Let's start off with number 50. To this day, I'm kicking myself I didn't put this on my year-end list in 2013. But there is a part of me that's a bit glad that I waited, because while I'd like to consider myself pretty mature when I was at the tender age of 23, I also know some parts of this album I wouldn't have really gotten until I approached it with a little bit more weariness and life experience. So, not for the first time yet ahead, let's talk about Jason Isbell.
We just drink our drinks and laugh out loud, bitch about the weekend crowd and try to ignore the elephant somehow.
Many folks will hold up this album as Jason Isbell's best work, and not just of the 2010s, but his entire catalog, solo, with the 400 unit, or with the Drive-By Truckers. Now to me, not quite, if only because it feels kind of transitional, and while its absolute best cuts will soar to the best in his catalog, and you can argue that Elephant might be the best song he has ever written, it's also confrontational with newfound sobriety, where he's still trying to figure out some of the details. The rich storytelling is very much there, but it's not quite as expansive, as he has to sift through a lot of hard facts and paints hard pictures of lingering trauma, which it's hard to articulate, even for a songwriter as good as him. It's also the first time he's working with the soon-to-be acclaimed producer and future frequent feature of this list, Dave Cobb, and the more bare sound, you can tell they were still working out some of the kinks, but at the end of the day, it's still Jason Isbell, and he's got a knack for the quiet kind of devastating, where it does not get that much better than this, well, except for more later on this list. We'll get to them. Number 49. I got more backlash than I preferred for this winding up on my 2017 list, when to most people, it dropped in the very late of 2016. Probably should have been slotted there, but it doesn't feel like a 2016 album to me. It doesn't fit the mood, it doesn't match the intensity or the creeping melancholic dread of the majority of that year, but when we all wanted to bellow righteous murder at the heavens.
We return from the depths of the Batman, with a gun and a knife and a waistband, with the war with the devil and Shaitan. He wore a bad toupee and a spray tan, so high now hoping that I land on a Thai stick moving through Thailand. On the radio heard a plane hijack, government did that like they cook crack.
The first album was an experiment, the second album was a polemic, and the third might as well have been a victory lap. Run the Jewels at that point, they could play arenas and they could play stadiums, and thus they built an album with the scope and impact that could feel every single crevice of them. It feels so goddamn triumphant in its bangers and its braggadocious swagger that it actually takes a second for the revolutionary side to re-emerge, but it does, in spades. Killer Mike has always had that level of intensity, but I would argue it is LP who took the biggest steps on this project, not just in amplifying his tangled punchlines and production to new heights, but also tapping into a populism he has rarely nurtured in his entire career, going back to Company Flow. There was a real leap happening here, and yet for as much as this album's got a sprawling, stentorian presence, it still takes the time to make some heartfelt and raw moments, and I hold that Thursday in the Danger Room with Kamasi Washington, it's one of the most powerful rap songs that was put out this decade, and yet, I don't know, still not quite my favorite of their catalog. We'll get to that. Number 48. I can make an argument that this is an album that changed the entire trajectory of independent country music. Not just in breaking away from the cliches that were ossifying certain scenes, but also showing the balance that could be kept between the traditional and the forward-thinking. A pendulum that's swinging back and forth between the modern and the postmodern of the artistic approach. Gee, I wonder, is there a word for that?
I've seen Jesus play with flames in a lake of fire that I was standing in. Met the devil in Seattle, spent 9 months inside the lion's den.
This is my favorite Sturgill Simpson album to date because while A Sailor's Guide to Earth in 2016 was audacious in its artistic expanse on a major label, this was Sturgill Simpson hitting the precise center point between the sharp, traditional country compositions and recognizing their power coming off of High Top Mountain and all the tangled psychedelic weirdness to come. All produced by Dave Cobb, there he is again, giving it the texture and impeccable balance that it really needed. What's often missed is that the album's themes, they're burrowing into that double-sided question of metamodernism, building on a foundation of tradition and recognizing the modernist power that can come there, but also seeing where those systems can be prodded or shaped or warped to say something a little more. Where, of course, it's going to make sense for him to cover The Promise from synth-pop group When in Rome, or make multiple acid-tinged freakout songs, or slam down the most obvious cocaine anthem in the genre, and then send it creeping by too many folks who didn't notice. Yeah, I was one of them. And yeah, you could argue that this album basically spent its entire runtime justifying its own existence, but Sturgill Simpson kicked down a door surrounding not only what indie country could be in the 2010s, but also how it could become so much more. Gotta salute to it. Something special. Number 47. If there is an entry on this list where I can say, okay, this is the easy one, it's here. Not to disparage the album, far from it. I can argue that its influences have only become more entrenched in the past 5 or so years, but everyone who knows their indie rock, they know this is great. Let's get it out of the way now. Now granted, this might be one of those projects where folks don't quite contextualize how robust and lasting this album is, or how well its sweeping, reverbed expanses have held up. Where a deeper understanding from 2017 blasted everything away to a blinding sheen for, in my opinion, better, but also for worse in some audiences, this is still coming out of that shoegaze mist, still shaking off some of Kurt Weill's lethargic pace in order for something to ramp up in its heartfelt yearning for more, staring into the cold winds of time with the hope the pealing guitars and gleaming keys will preserve something real. But that constant sense of the intangible is what makes this album a hit and what gives it so much resonance to this very day. Also, you can argue that Red Eyes is a well-deserved indie rock staple with just so much goddamn melody and swell that even if you can't make out what Adam Granduciel's hollering, you just know what it means. You just know. Number 46. There's a part of me that wants to say that some of the luster has faded with this album, given how he didn't quite follow it up as strongly nor as timely as he really could have. He was just a one-album wonder who could never really top what he laid down. Now, personally, I think it's way too early in order to make that assessment, but even if he was, man, what an album that he delivered.
We'll see Alexis be detected, ride round picking up tools. We'll leave our children, Jackie and Wilson, raise them on rhythm and blues.
I mean, if you only know the bluesy, gothic immensity of Take Me to Church, I'd argue you're doing yourself a disservice, because Hozier is a much more layered beast here, and he always has been. I mean, I could go on about how he's one of the most striking and potent voices in modern rock, or how his pileup of genres spanning blues and soul and gospel and folk and goth rock and garage rock should not be as organic and rich of its blend as it is. But what I've always loved about Hozier is the writing. A guy this melodramatic and horny should not be able to stick the landing with as much drug-saturated, swaggering romanticism as he really does. The raging chat of the Renaissance fair, the hipster speakeasy, where I would argue Take Me to Church might get some of his gravitas, but not the wit and levity that fills the rest of the album. And what's even better is that the framing actually gives the moral ambiguity a lot of tempered focus. A real self-awareness that is very welcome and you kinda need, or this could get really pompous or obnoxious. Granted, if you only know the one hit, you owe yourself to check out so much more Hozier. It's a wild ride, let me tell you, but so rewarding. Number 45. You know, going through this list, there's not quite as much white, middle-class, sad boy indie rock as I thought that there would be. I mean, you can give me at least one, right?
But I stayed down with my demons. I stayed down with my demons.
Yep, controversial opinion time. This is the National's best album coming out of the 2010s. It's not High Violet, not I Am Easy to Find, certainly not Sleep Well Beast, but if we're looking for the project that kinda nailed that whole reverb-saturated, ponderous indie rock sound of that era that sinks into the thick, sinuous grooves from Aaron Dessner and Matt Berninger's baritone that is trying and failing to keep it all together, it is this. What I like so much about Trouble Will Find Me is that while it broods and can get tangled up in its own demons where it's gonna stay down among, it is an album that is both adult and self-aware enough to paint much harsher pictures in order to ground that angst. There's something so middle-aged about a lot of the National's music, and this album damn near centers that that midlife crisis with a sort of dramatic missteps that are frankly way too believable, and it adds that human element. But the album is also not paced like a wallow or a dirge. The crescendos, the raw swell, the swing for the fences, they're all here. It gives the drama both weight and populism. And while it is not the best project that Matt Berninger would ever make, spoiler alert, there is a heft to the maturity that is very tasteful, but also emotionally rich along the way. There's more going on. So naturally, what we should follow it up with is number 44. Yeah, this is her best album. I've been saying it for years now, but if you want the gleaming example of everything that she can deliver in spades,
All I need is to get in between your sheets. Oh, I just want your dirty love.
you know, by all accounts, this album should be nowhere near as great as it actually is. The recording process was reportedly absolute hell, courtesy of the dick piston executive producer. It sprays across half a dozen different genres with out-of-nowhere guest features, and the rollout was crippled by a lot of bad luck even before the bungling from the label kicked in. But even despite all that, Kesha pulls Warrior past the finish line on charisma and firepower alone. All the splashy punk rock edges, they're all over this thing, even before she brings in Julian Casablancas of the Strokes and Iggy Pop, and the album serves as a giant middle finger to everyone who wanted to pigeonhole her as the vapid, trashy queen of the party girls. There's nothing wrong with being that, but she could be and was more. Now I should note here, in a rare exception to a lot of my rules, I'm including the deluxe edition of this album on this list, because it contains 3 of her best genre-bending cuts with Last Goodbye, Gold Trans Am, and Past Lives. The last a glimpse of that psychedelic Flaming Lips collaboration Lipsha, of which we were all robbed. But that's the thing, without horrible management, Warrior proves that she could have done it all. Electropop, punk rock, psychedelic rock, country rock, southern rock, arena rock. She is such a dynamic presence and force of will that not only does it feel natural, it shows just how she could have commanded those genres for years to come, across all the 2010s in my argument, with deceptively great and complex writing to boot. There's more going on here. Yeah, I know. The majority of folks got on board with Rainbow. It was a more tasteful entry point. But with Warrior, overloaded with bangers, glitter, and heartfelt power, this should have ruled the 2010s. And if you knew, it did. Number 43. I got on board with this artist with this album. Spoilers, he's going to show up a couple more times in this list. But even when I was putting things together, I kept finding myself a little bit surprised how much all this held up. It's one of those albums where you might overlook it at first glimpse and find yourself wondering, I must have been on something when I was listening to this. It cannot be that good, right? But then you put it on, and, well...
We the best mostly, sometimes the freshest rhymers. We the tightest kind of, respect my qualifiers. Respect my qualifiers, respect my qualifiers, respect my qualifiers, respect my...
Open Mike Eagle might have a show now on Comedy Central, but you only have to go back a couple of years to this project for him laying down all the seeds for it. And if anything, it has only aged masterfully. The glitchier work production, it might have felt discomforting for me getting into it back in 2014, but nowadays it's this uncanny compliment that can't help but draw attention to his phenomenal and often underappreciated gift for melody and hooks. And yeah, the absurdity of some of these scenes is genuinely funny, and some of the reference points are inspired until they become more than a little too uncomfortably real. And the sharp, very human critique of the commodification of black art and black pain, it gives this album a deceptive amount of teeth, especially as Open Mike Eagle's humility makes sure that the framing will never cast him as more than just the modern everyman who's struggling to find a medium to build those real connections and translate his truth. Like all his friends, he doesn't have much money, but he's got all those talents to behold. I mean, it's a wonderfully subtle and layered project that even when you don't revisit it that often, it's hard to forget, even if that means it slips below the radar too often, which might be dark comedy indeed. Number 42. We go from a project that's deceptively low-key to one that's deceptively simple and very much in your face. And hell, one could argue is just repeating the same goddamn formula as its predecessor, just with a flashier palette. Of course, there's a lot more going on here, and it's one of the best goddamn synth pop albums of the decade.
And you have this belief that you're gonna build what I don't need. And I know I need to feel relief.
The fact that this album didn't make Church's mainstream pop stars kind of drives me nuts even to this day. This was an album chock full of the huge groove-driven waves of synth that could easily slide into the 80s analogs of the time that were so damn popular. The hooks were damn near impossible to deny. Lauren Mayberry was such a razor-sharp and commanding pop presence. And Martin Doherty remains the album's secret weapon in adding just enough balanced context to a pretty cutting breakup album. Seriously, high enough to carry you over. It's already an underappreciated gem, and it is brilliant in the context of the album. Such a great complexifier. But Every Open Eye only improved on the foundation of their debut, The Bones of What You Believe from 2013, by, in my opinion, adding a bit more of a feminine touch, letting softness and emotional vulnerability color the messy arc of attempted reconciliation, and when then she has to let it all go again for real, it provides an emotional richness that the sharper angles of previous projects wouldn't have really gathered in the same way. But hell, that's the fine detail that often goes overlooked in how blazingly assertive the writing and delivery is. Again, on a simpler base level, when the hooks are just this good, you can't deny what you're getting. It's just that impactful. And yeah, it kind of drives me nuts that churches seem to be playing the whole mainstream pop chase now instead of further perfecting this approach and letting them come to them. But at least here, this was the gleaming rainbow sledgehammer we needed. Highly recommended. Number 41. There are some albums that only seem to get better the older I get. Maybe it's because the layered emotional resonance feels a little bit more relatable. Maybe it's because the fine details in the scenes become more familiar with time and experience. Or maybe it's just me catching on to more of those wry, craggy, but very real and valid emotions smuggled in between the lines. And thus, to add to the canon of projects that have been many times ignored by too many people,
here's to all you strangers, the Mets and the Rangers. Long may we thrive on the Long Island Sound.
This is the only album that James McMurtry put out in the 2010s, and you could make the argument it was the only one he needed to release, being as fantastic as it is, but I would have been happy for more. The warm country folk backdrop that picks up just enough rock smolder in order to vary the sound, James McMurtry's imperfect but very cutting and surprisingly expressive delivery if you're looking for the details, and the writing. Yeah, many folks in the know, they might remember the protest song We Can't Make It Here from 2005 as his signature cut, but this album was tempering all those old scenes and messy relationships with both the detail and insight that comes with getting older, while still exposing just enough nerves that time is gonna scrub raw. Also, he wrote my favorite song of 2015 in Long Island Sound, which might be one of the most complicated and resonant cuts ever written about growing older and understanding where you've had to go and what you've had to leave behind. But again, it lives up to the title in both finding both the humor, pain, and heart in all of it. I keep hearing rumors that James McMurtry's got another album coming at some point, if not this year, then the next. Man, that'd be nice. Right about now. Just saying. Number 40. This is an album I think went overlooked by too many people. Maybe under the belief that it was a side project or a collaboration that did not deserve more attention. Or maybe just because it was esoteric and off-kilter and there was more immediate hip-hop that came out in 2016. Yeah, let's correct some assumptions.
Follow you home. It's all fine and dandy when the show starts. Before then, avoid it like a ghost fart. I get one ups and downs, but for the most part, nobody smiles at me cause I'm a black man.
Open Mike Eagle created a day in a world of his own, distressingly similar to ours in many ways, and he'll be more than happy to point out all the little spots where we've ignored the uncomfortable details, all coaxed through an organic, sample-rich backdrop from Paul White that is as melodic as it is eclectic. No jokes, of all of Open Mike Eagle's projects in the 2010s, this is by far his most accessible, easiest to revisit, and probably his most insanely catchy and quotable. An album that wants to prise open the root to every single microaggression to find all the nuggets of small humanity within, which gives this project a very layered and flawed humanity that is hella personal, but also intensely likable and relatable for everyone. It's funny, it's heartfelt, it's deeply insightful, might not be his best, but it's the best point to jump on board if you're curious. Ergo, it's gone overlooked. Change that. Number 39. Of course, if we're going to talk about high concept, a day in the life rap music that is both funny, heartbreaking, and can be intensely relatable.
Bitch, don't kill my vibe. 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 Look inside of my soul and you can find gold and maybe get rich. Look inside of your soul and you can find out it never exists.
No jokes here. It took me a surprisingly long time to come around on Good Kid, Mad City by Kendrick Lamar. I mean, it's not my favorite Kendrick album by a significant margin, more on that in a little bit, but it's also kind of front-loaded. The narrative kind of fragments in the final third, even if I do think there's some nuggets of brilliance there. Tonal whiplash can get kind of distracting, and I've never really loved the singles in the same way so many people did when they first got introduced into Kendrick, oftentimes from this project. But I did come around, and this album's expansive, textured, and deeply human exploration of human expectations and transgressions in the face of an uncaring, brutal world, it's a tableau to behold. This is an album that fully blow open the doors of what sort of storyteller and MC Kendrick Lamar could be, and how he would bend and twist his delivery to fit dark, swampy West Coast grooves that felt like a masterclass in creating all this down-to-earth atmosphere. Well, at least until the kids stepped up into a much wider story, but we'll get to that. In the meantime, this is still fantastic. Number 38. Full disclosure, this album would likely be in my top 20 or higher if it had actually stuck the landing. It ends on an utterly baffling sour note that doesn't match with anything sonically or thematically, but even with that, damn near the best thing Poets of the Fall ever put together.
I don't need a miracle. I'm much more predictable. I just need you to show me this life.
To me, this is the apotheosis of what Poets of the Fall could create coming out of alternative metal. The guitar work is huge and pristine. The grooves provided a real coursing undercurrent. The drums hit with so much texture and impact. Marco Seresto's vocals were at their most expressive, and he frankly bellows his heart out here. The arranged elements only intensify all that swell, and even the delicate acoustic ballads were beautifully produced. I mean, outside of the ending, there's not a miss here in terms of that epic power, while still maintaining a fascinatingly emotive texture, the crystallization of the past decade of projects. Honestly, it feels a bit like a greatest hits album where the hooks are damn near every single song are soaring and stirring. And again, if it wasn't for that Revolution Roulette-esque cut at the very end, this would be held in even a higher esteem by me, and for damn good reason. This soars. Something special. Number 37. One of the fascinating trends I observed in the 2010s was the rise of poptimist criticism that gave a genre previously shunned the sort of deserving scrutiny and acclaim that more of a chance for a different sort of spotlight. Now, I've got mixed opinions on the overall executions and result of that movement. It involves a much larger conversation about stan culture and the music industry and social media and capitalism. It's complicated, again, for a later day. But another trend worth noting is the shift of certain acts in rock and metal towards the realization of, oh wait, we can do this too. Why not give it a try? And while I knew he was capable, I did not expect that Steven Wilson would strike this much gold.
Wake it up to see through you with all this fear and the same asylum as before.
Yep, the genius, multi-instrumentalist, and producer and songwriter behind Porcupine Tree and a slew of fanatically received progressive rock albums in the 2010s. I've seen the comments, I know you're there. He decides to go pop and he makes his best album this decade. What I love about To The Bone, beyond the insanely good production and the challenging writing and the themes that show Steven Wilson actually willing to confront some of his own deeply personal neuroses and demons with the most pushback that he's gotten on a record that he's ever seen, it's the compositional approach to this album. Because yes, there's gonna be those progressive, amazingly intricate breakdowns at Steven Wilson, but a pop focus drives him to write hooks, and not only are they very distinctive, they're strikingly catchy, showing a sense of populism that's evaded him for decades. It's an album that's so damn thrilling for the gateways it opens up for him as an artist that you almost kind of forget how intense and incisive this project can be. For Steven Wilson, progressive pop rock, it became a revelation that actually allowed him to go deeper, and this ride was something else entirely. This project's been overlooked by too many people. It kicks ass. Number 36. To this day, I think this album got a bad rap from people who should know better misinterpreting it, to the point where I had to spend more time than I wanted to correcting the record when I reviewed the album 2 years ago. Let's finally put some of that to bed now, shall we?
By the time that you realize the new you is a drag, she'll be rolling in new love, and you'll be rolling on the exile rag.
Kyle Craft is one of the best new talents of the 2010s, certainly in his brand of rock, and I don't think it's particularly close here either. Not only does he step onto the scene with a glam rock holler that feels pulled from a different time, his sophomore album added a lot more riotous and wild arranged instrumentation that reflected a lot of the relationships in which he was more yanked along for the ride than having any real impetus or power in order to change them. This album feels like a garish, hyper-stylized whirlwind, and while there is absolutely a hard-loving, quasi-toxic side that can color some moments, Kyle Craft also knows when to knuckle it back when it becomes clear he's not really the lead character in a lot of these stories, even if he might desperately want to be. It's a project that's both smarter and a lot more progressive in its mingling of influences and its exploration of masculinity than many people gave it credit, simply latching on to a lot of the writing and the glam rock style and assuming he was a bit of a lecherous creep, where even if that might have been true, there was way more going on. Often placed directly in the exquisitely paced and impeccably balanced writing, the poetry in this album is so good. Full spoilers, of course you're going to be seeing him again on this list because this was not quite his best effort in the 2010s, but still a tour de force regardless. Number 35. I remember first covering this album before I even had a YouTube channel, back when I was just blogging, and I found this album from a little-known country act and she completely blew my mind. And now 7 years later, she's won a lot of Grammys and has sketched out quite the arc for projects that trend towards a lot of softer, mistier material. Not quite where I would have expected, given her foundation here eclipses them all, but hey, what can you really do?
Mary, Mary, quack and cherry. We get bored, so we get married. Just like dust, we settle in this town. On this broken merry-go-round.
What Casey Musgraves has always been excellent with is balance. The sweetness of her delivery and some of her folksy metaphors rooted in classic country until they reveal a much more stark and challenging reality underneath it all. And this was the project that really hammered it home. A little less pretty for the effort, but she made up for it with writing that went darker and pulled fewer punches, where the sadness and anger was tempered by a quick wit, a stunning eye for revealing detail, and a willingness to shove mainstream country, specifically in Nashville, kicking and screaming towards modernity. Keep in mind, this was dropped just before the apex of bro country later that year, where she would yank back the curtain on all the small towns they'd yammer about, but also keep a fragment of hope and show their value. Coupled with the world-weary complexity of her kiss-off songs and trying to find some vestige of peace, I'm not at all surprised this caught fire. She deserves to be a superstar beyond those who are just in the know, and I think I've been following that arrow ever since it took flight. Number 34. And you know, while we're on the topic of thoughtful, low-key, brilliantly written, wonderfully performed projects debuted by women who have all the potential in the world to speak against power structures.
I know everyone goes someday. I know my body's fragile, know it's made from clay. But if I have to go, I pray my soul is still eternal and my mama don't forget about me. I pray my mama don't forget about me.
You know, there's a part of me that knows that with her activism in the past couple of years, there's a very real possibility we will not get another no-name album, which kind of really saddens me because her writing is emotive and brilliant, and her blend of groovy, jazz-inflected instrumentals is so warm and tasteful, and she effortlessly walks the line between subtle and sensual charisma and a firebrand lurking beneath so many clever lines, tempered with a lot of real human complexity along the way. I mean, Telephone might have set the scene, but Room 25 feels like the first of so many awakenings. Self-possessed, but populist, and still searching for all the ways in order to keep you guessing. And even then, she's not gonna share it all with that audience. To paraphrase my old review, even the black every woman she plays has to keep a little something for herself in the end. True, warm, yearning brilliance, and while her cause will likely take her elsewhere and she'll deliver far more good, I would love to hear more along the way, if she's up to it. Number 33. I think we're going to stick in debuts for a bit longer, although if we're talking about an inversion of what No Name delivered in supple, brilliant Hope, this is just as incisive and gripping, but considerably darker and rougher, where the intensity commands the room like a troubadour from another time, daring you to hear his bloody tale.
Oh, rest easy, Madeline. I'm bringing down the pain across this flooded county line. And when I get home, we'll have a grand old time.
So, this album is bleak as all hell and pulling together a grimy, frequently blood-stained picture of the American experience, specifically the rural American experience, that also pulls precisely zero punches, to the point where you'd think there wouldn't be anything fanciful to be found. And yet, amidst all the frequent disasters and downward spiral of many a scene on this album, Ian No somehow finds the shaky ray of hope. Two of his love songs, they're coaxed through a train flying off a bridge and an outlaw finally getting caught and gunned down, and they still manage to soar. It has the smoky, gristly texture of this album all across the board, all enhanced by, of course, Dave Cobb's production will thicken a lot of that detail, and highlights how the savagery of that past, not all that far removed from today, but the spirit will persist regardless. Such a potent debut, we can only wonder what snarled trails will await him next between the country. Number 32. I can argue this is the most underrated album of the 2010s. It got some attention, but a lot more raised eyebrows, dismissive scoffs, and general disinterest. And that's not surprising. It's a side project pairing a potent but not overpowering frontman with a lesser-known indie veteran, and the sound was going to be very different. And the points of thematic reference, they just seemed weird, at least on first listen. And yet...
Return to the moon. I'm tired. Return to the moon.
There is a part of me that is convinced that this is the best thing Matt Berninger has ever done. And yes, I'm including all of the national albums in that, including Boxer, and I love Boxer. Because if you spend your entire career making very tasteful, well-respected indie rock, Elvi was the giant middle finger in the face of all that, in terms of deconstructing and tearing down both the act and the predominantly middle-class white male fan base that would preen all over it. This is an album where the well-regarded frontman is revealed to be a total, unbearable hipster asshole. And not only is that the point, but it will lead to some of the most groove-driven, utterly infectious takedowns, full of a lot of cutting-in jokes, off-the-wall references, including an extended parallel drawn to the classic Minutemen album Double Nickels on the Dime, and it's kind of inspired in how it does so. And also, the woman, the person who he considers an object of his affection, who is still thoroughly sick of his shit and is not giving you the happy ending. I mean, I didn't know how Matt Matt Berninger could go back to making national albums after such a brutal deconstruction of his own archetype and his own audience. And yet, even though he did, this collaboration with Brett Note, formerly of Melamina and Ramona Falls, it is inspired in every way. The definition of an album that seems like critic bait until it undresses said critic in front of everyone, which means it's the definition of a cult album, and y'all need to hear it. It's fucking incredible. Number 31. This is the sort of album that some viewed as a backslide. That he was revisiting this subject matter with such naked clarity felt a bit like a relapse, a simplification. He had put all this behind him. He was supposed to go forth and tell a lot of beautiful new stories to carry us all on our merry ways. But yeah, Jason Isbell, he had another thing coming.
Maybe the Cumberland Gap just swallows you whole. Maybe the Cumberland Gap just swallows you whole.
When I first covered this album, I assumed it had the power to spark real change within country music. Certainly the indie scene, probably a little bit too optimistic, as it instead split Jason Isbell's fan base along some very political lines. Because what he realized is that, while it's always good to be looking forward and trying to move on, sometimes you can quiet a demon, but you can't quite kill it. And thus the Nashville sound, of course produced by Dave Cobb, but this time with his full backing band behind him, including his wife Amanda Shires, has Jason Isbell roaring back at that abyss. Not just examining his own culpability in bad systems left unchecked, but also the deeper roots of his anxiety and fears that he might have papered over, but hasn't truly escaped. And thus this album is rougher, it's more jagged, setting his jaw against battles both big and small, and while it is not all victories, chaos enclosed means that a certain name will cast a shadow over the moral complexities of this album, and it is a question I will raise, but it also features If We Were Vampires, which might be one of the best slow burn gothic love stories of the 2010s. I mean, the high road may not have brought us all home just yet. God damn it, the sound will ride with us until it does. Number 30. I can't imagine how difficult this album might have been to make. Not just in the climate of the times, but also the striking pictures it was trying to paint. But you know what? If we're talking about where Open Mike Eagle delivered a third masterstroke on this list, it was here.
Young children making code words in the projects around the world.
You know, when it comes to certain political albums, I honestly wish they could age a little worse, that the unceasing dread and exhausting trauma of gentrification, having the willpower to create your own hero story in your home because society won't care to write one for you, only to see it bulldozed away in your horrified wake, that the unease and that the fear would become a little less familiar. We can hope, right? But that's the subtle and quiet power of this album. Only by the end does it all come crashing down in one climactic, devastating fell swoop, but for the majority of the album it just lurks in the background, and Open Mike Eagle just has to struggle with the overstimulated nightmare that is, well, now. But again, it's not all just trauma. Open Mike Eagle is at his height as a creative storyteller here, not just for capturing the constant, quiet ache, but the deflective notes of hope that can provide at least a little bit of relief, coupled with stunningly detailed, experimental, organic grooves with great texture, and an emotive performance with a lot of subtle power that I really appreciated. Yeah, it's Open Mike Eagle's best work to date. Pretty common opinion, but I believe it. And it's a signpost that more genius is aplenty yet to come from this giant. Number 29. I remember being so angry watching the Grammys nearly 10 years ago. I mean, come on, beating out Eminem's glorious comeback that year. For a white boy in his very early 20s who was barely starting to expand his musical horizons, this indie act could not be that special, right?
That we can never get away from the sprawl, living in the sprawl, dead shopping malls, rise like mountains beyond mountains, and there's no end in sight. I need the darkness, someone please cut the lights.
Yeah, that was a true story. More than a little embarrassing given how badly Recovery has aged in Eminem's back catalog, but instead let's talk about the tour de force that Arcade Fire delivered here. The sort of glorious, pulse-pounding indie rock that dared to aim high without damnation or praise of the titular neighborhoods, as much as trying to find that vaguely formed aspirational locus to find something that keeps you going. It's an album that's searching for purpose and high romance and yet can't quite figure out what the hell that even looked like, but it's gonna try for something anyway. And what I love is that a band that tries so very hard to be this high-minded and abstract in their ideas like Arcade Fire are, and often for the worse, is that when they could focus their compositions, they found this lean and nervy energy that mirrors both youth and those who are chasing it when they lost it. With a lack of direction, it's the point all along. And let's just be real, Sprawl 2 is the best song the band has ever written and another titan of epic indie rock. In finding populism, Arcade Fire found their soul. I mean, they can go back to it anytime, just saying. Number 28. But you know, while we're in the vicinity of ridiculous bombast from acts that nobody saw coming,
Isn't it easy when the world's got nothing against you? Isn't it harder when it seems like nobody cares? They're just not dancing disapproval of your words. Isn't it easy man to watch these bridges burn?
it's short, it's wildly colorful. To some, it's probably kind of difficult to take all that seriously, especially if you know their back catalog, and yet Moron Police blew past all of them with a progressive rock act that is eons better than it has any right to be. Where their comedy was forced before, it's now the spice to fantastic melodies, excellently balanced arrangements, and hooks that will just soar even before you get the razor-sharp anti-war satire. The funny thing is that this album is so damn anthemic that if they wanted to make a pro-war power metal album or something, they'd probably be among the best of that genre, but Moron Police thankfully seem to have better instincts, and good thing too. You can also tell they're both a little bit thrilled and kind of astounded that their new album went down so well, and that only makes me so encouraged for whatever might be waiting in the wings. This is the great, grand promise of the best of progressive rock. Utterly in its own lane, smart and willing to take you along for the ride, and overflowing with fun. I mean, I can't wait for whatever they wash ashore next. It's gonna be a hoot. Number 27. The music critic Ian Cohen mused on Twitter a couple weeks back what it would be like if certain acts in a pop punk or an emo space got the same lyrical attention as your average singer-songwriter album, like from, I don't know, Bill Callahan. But then I looked at this band that he referenced in that tweet and where they are placed on my list, and then I looked back at the tweet and I wondered, I mean, you weren't doing that already? Why not? Okay, not to come down on Ian Cohen too hard, I get where he's coming from. Pop-punk acts are often pigeonholed for writing about the same stuff over and over again, and that can be true for a lot of acts in that genre. But then you got the upper tier, especially in the 2010s, with acts like the Wonder Years, and contrary to the majority of critical opinions, I would argue this is their best album, not the greatest generation. For one, it feels a lot more grounded in what it is, and I mean centered in that location, parsing through a landscape both intimately familiar and in decay in both mind, heart, and location. Like the Suburbs, it doesn't come to damn or praise, but that's less out of complicated nostalgia, so much as I'm not sure the Wonder Years could hit either raw nerve to do so. The Suburbs are too formative for them, and too many folks that they love are still there. It also feels way more grounded in the reality of the modern suburbs, not an ideal. The NIMBY attitudes, the messy architecture of religion, the omnipresent overcast boredom, but also the cycle of inspiration and recurrence that they can somehow inspire. Also, along with great themes, to get the Wonder Years' best ever hooks and production production that pretty much they're of their entire careers. Again, the Greatest Generation always felt a little bit monochromatic for all of its ambitions, and setting the highest echelon of what pop punk can really be as a genre, while still kicking a lot of ass. I mean, they sure gave us a lot, folks, and they sure as hell aren't nothing in return. Number 26. I remember about 2.5 years ago when I did a video with Anthony Fantano on how to get into modern country, and I think even he was shocked that I included this album on that list. And as much of his fans don't tend to be all that fond of me, this was certainly a choice that probably scandalized a few. So let's make that case now, shall we?
I saw goodbye in her eyes. Don't think I can change it.
I have said this a couple of times now, but with the Zac Brown Band, it is truer than ever, especially given their extremely steep drop-off in quality. This album has no business being this great. Yeah, with the band, they could always play with a ton of organic presence, and they would, of course, have their little island side that's trying to rip off Jimmy Buffett, and the harmonies would be rich and tremendously inviting. But what Uncaged was where Zac Brown and crew took that working formula and decided to prod in more directions. The hooks got considerably better, the writing got sharper, the experiments got a little bit rougher, a little more interesting, but before the band could ever spiral out of control, they would reel things back in hard, with a real ass-kicking jam that was everything one could hope for out of the Zac Brown Band. Hell, they did a smoky soul song with Trombone Shorty, and I think it wound up better than any other attempt at that sound or that topic in mainstream Nashville country since. But the Zac Brown Band would not have gotten this high on my list if it wasn't for the fact that the content actually took a step up. The writing was more nuanced, more adult, more intelligent. And while the band has always been kind of heartfelt in their sentiments, we get that final third that feels about as emotionally poignant and invested as the band has ever been. It isn't quite as self-satisfied as the band's often been tagged. And you know, at the end of the day, I can go on about all the important releases on this list, or I can highlight a rich, feel-good experience that can persist outside of pretensions of import. I mean, real damn shame they couldn't follow it up, but at least here, this was special. But alright, we've gone through 3/4 of this list. Take a breather, everybody. It's been a very, very long ride, but we're down to the very best. And you'll want to be locked in for it proper. You need a break. There's no shame in stepping away for a second, pausing the video, go on, then maybe come back, finish it all off. Alright, y'all ready for it? You sure? Okay then, number 25. Okay, there are 2 albums on or adjacent to this list that the more I heard them, for as much as I loved them, they were more because they were so evocative in their soundscape that I thought they might even be better off as stage musicals than on a record. And that's not a dig at all, by the way. I really like musicals. I appreciate projects that have that sort of swell and grandiose ambition. Now, the first was just an honorable mention with Dr. Dre's Compton project, which I still hold is widely misunderstood and wildly underrated. But this can't be all that much different. It's the second. Like Ariel Lucassen built an album that was just for me. A progressive metal epic based off of interpolations of A Beautiful Mind, dealing with high concept physics, experimental drugs, the rivalry of geniuses, a frustration with certain levels of parental figures and the complicated relationship that bounces between them, the vast unknowable cosmos of knowledge, all backed up by members of Nightwish, Camelot, Dream Theater, Yes, Lacuna Coil, and more. That's grandiose. That's high concept, and with such an eye for the personal detail that recalls Arian's uncanny knack for human framing that made The Human Equation from 2004 a prog metal classic. I mean, even outside of the Arion narrative, this might stack up among his best for such a command of atmosphere and compositional diversity. Even if I would describe the best way to hear this album as 4 distinctive 20-minute songs, the performances, the drama, they are gripping enough to hold their own. As of this year, there actually is a new album from Arion that at this time of recording, I haven't heard it. I can only dream it'll kick this much ass, because in setting the bar for progressive metal, yeah, he did it again. Something amazing. Number 24. So there are 3 albums from this artist on this list, and I'm kind of stunned that at the end of the day, despite what I can imagine is the broad disagreement of everybody, this was the one that wound up as my favorite.
Are you taking a grown-up dose? Do you live with a man who knows you like I thought I did back then? But I guess I never did.
In a way, I kind of wish I had talked about this project before discussing the Nashville sound, because a big underlying reason that so many people question the recurrence of old demons on the Nashville sound is because, well, Something More Than Free literally slammed the door shut on them in its penultimate track. Southeastern might have been the sifting through a lot of the debris of his life to start pulling things back together, but this is the album where he actually started trying to move on. And yes, while some of those old ghosts will certainly pop up to haunt him, there is that sense of reassured safety that came in his observational songwriting that felt like the biggest of new beginnings. And for a Dave Cobb arrangement, because again, of course he's here, the subtle progressive rock touches creeping onto some of the most expansive moments, it gave this album such a sense of lived-in continuity that I had to respect. And while my favorite songs are pretty well established, 24 Frames, Children of Children, that penultimate track, The Life You Chose, I also want to highlight here that Speed Trap Town features probably the most powerful observation made about sports in music since All Kinds of Time by Fountains of Wayne, and that might have been what has really put this over the top for me, especially as a former athlete myself. As of this point, it's Jason Isbell's best album, but I know him. Only a matter of time before he surpasses it. He's got that in him. Number 23. Full disclosure, in the albums nearing the top of this list, to nobody's surprise, there'll probably be more personal notes and anecdotes. It's my list, goddammit. It's important to provide context to why a project works, especially when it's pretty left field. And as such, while I might think the greatness might be immediately apparent, I can't assume that, especially for some of the entries ahead. With that being said, I don't think there's an album that ruled my 2017 more, and I literally cannot think of anything else quite like it.
No one knows where the back gate flows. The river goes where the water flows. No one knows where the back gate flows.
If this album had just been pure goth rock or dark wave in the vein of Rain in Soho, I mean, I probably still would have loved it, but that's not quite what John Darnielle was aiming to do with this. Instead, he made a soft rock, smooth jazz singer-songwriter project and an exploration not just of goth and industrial music, but of the people who lived in that scene, both going in and coming out. And again, this should not work. Given the sound regardless, you'd think there would have to be more trappings and texture, but John Darnielle knows that capturing the normalcy outside the club is what builds that sense of the outcast, amplifying the frustrated alienation in a subculture that was all about that, and then framed with the humanity that can both critique and sympathize with the loners seeking whatever fragile, nerdy connection they can find. And I will admit that at so many points, it almost felt uncanny how well it framed a lot of my experience in goth. Not quite fully engulfed in the scene, but enough of it translated that emotionality and that the experiences, they felt all too real and very familiar. I mean, it's also a music nerd's dream of an album, stuffed to the gills with a lot of obscure references, and Rain in Soho might be one of the best singles that dropped this decade in any genre, kind of unquantifiable, but this is a haunted genius that I can ascribe to. Hit the saxophone, play it out. Number 22. There's a part of me that loves the provocation of this album even before I loved the album itself. A country supergroup of unlikely voices, not just making a layered and complicated feminist statement, but also one that claimed its place regardless of any gatekeepers. Oh yeah, you've got my attention here.
I was a high woman and a mother from my youth. For my children I did what I had to do.
I mean, look, at some point for me, it feels like you're stacking the deck. Maren Morris is finally living up to her potential, teaming up with veterans like Brandy Carlisle and Amanda Shires, who of course is going to play fiddle, and it's going to sound wonderful. And then you have an underground darling like Natalie Hemby stepping in, produced by Dave Cobb, because again, he's here, and with writing credits from Miranda Lambert and Laurie McKenna, and a guest appearance from Sheryl Crow. And look, you already have my money. But the fact that this album actually aimed to do so much more is what actually makes it special. It's not a project that rests on the pedigree of upending history or tradition, but telling women's stories from messy and complicated angles, young and old, domestic and wild, believer or pagan, straight or lesbian. The power of this project is showing the imperfect union of all their voices, and recognizing how they all have a place to claim and then transcend it, which to me implies, really, if they want to just keep this as a brand name and bring on more artists in order to flesh out these stories, I would be thrilled to hear it. Get Emily Scott Robinson, Michaela Ann, Caitlyn Smith. You frankly owe a big one to Mickey Guyton. Bring back Yola. There is so many points of unbounded potential to what this could create. And in the meantime, this album's just fantastic. A challenging experience for more guys that's worth giving multiple chances, but oh yeah, it's worth it. Number 21. So I just mentioned this artist a minute or so ago, also mentioned her a while back, someone who was already involved behind the scenes but has had a storied career that we're going to be talking about a couple more times on this list, mostly because I've seen her overlooked entirely too many times by a lot of folks who should really know better. And thus, for one of the best songwriters of this decade,
I don't know how to pull you back. I don't know how to pull you close. All I know is how to wreck you.
Yep, surprise, another Dave Cobb production credit, but he is not as important as the voice at the core of this album. This is Laurie McKenna's midlife crisis project, where the emotionality is subtle but unmistakably charged, and you just know everything is on the cusp of falling apart, coaxed by memories of better times and better days, and a desperate plea that it might get better, but with framing that was way too honest to pull punches on that matter. It's not an album that feels as maternal as her last two releases, but it's also one that's had to consider the stakes of that maternity and the painful choices that have had to be made as a result. And age and time are factors. It helps that she's older that is sketching out these stories, not just for the nuance and the wisdom that color every choice, but also because she knows there's no purely good or bad people in these scenes. Even the hapless guys who might be right for a moment, but then wrong every other time. And when Dave Cobb gives her the precise, delicate touch and the quiet beauty of these instrumentals, well, not quite her best, but man, it gets close. Number 20. I know a lot of people for which this is at least in their top 10, if not their favorite album of the 2010s. For me, look, this shouldn't be a surprise. It wasn't even my top project that year, so understand if it's not that much of a high echelon for me. But when I hear a project that could well be a magnum opus for any other artist, and yet may well only be the highlight of the first act of his career, yeah, we got something magnificent indeed.
Bitch, where you and I was walking. Now I run a game, got the whole world talking. King Kunta, everybody wanna cut the legs off him. Kunta, black man taking no losses. Oh yeah.
So I'll just say it, there's a certain inadequacy to addressing this particular album in this way. There have been books written about To Pimp a Butterfly that I'm sure will capture more intricacy and layers than I can in a short snippet here. Even if I think my review holds up 5 years later, every single listen reveals more detail. The charged Afrocentrism of jazz rap blended with soul, funk, R&B, spoken word, touches of dancehall, all of which feels nothing short of biblical, where Kendrick Lamar has ascended to this height, but now must grapple with every temptation that comes forth for a black man in America, daring him to succumb, all the while racked with guilt for not being a better person along the way with all the power he's now amassed. It deals with the complicated mess of legacy, self-image, power every crack of America's foundation and every vile capitalistic demon that it's cultivated. And Kendrick has to transverse that hell, only for an icon that he's worshipped to leave him behind with even more questions by the very end. And while many have gotten behind All Right or King Kunta as the single that really should have ruled so much more of 2015, I will still argue The Blacker the Berry is the militant rage that isn't just one of the best songs of the decade, but also Kendrick Lamar at his best as a performer and lyricist. Yeah, Damn is a step back. I think we can all admit that now. And I don't know how much more will be coming after this rap rock experiment he's currently cooking up and will be dropping hopefully in the next year or so. But this album was an event, damn near unparalleled. And again, all the more frighteningly relevant every passing year. Really wish it wasn't, but I appreciate that it is. Number 19. There's no way I can talk about this album without acknowledging where I was when I first heard it. Just started a new job, I was coming off of a broken elbow, I was sick and utterly exhausted from an overextended year. I nearly hit rock bottom and was pretty close to just shutting everything down. 2018 had a few moments like that for me. Not as much the next year, but that's because the trauma there carried in different ways. But if there was an album that may not have nudged me back, but provided a sympathetic echo, it was this.
Take these weeds out of my head when I'm barely living and almost dead.
I don't know if emo country is a thing, but if it's not, Rustin Kelly is trailblazing it regardless. Not just in his side projects where he covers emo songs, but on a debut like this that hit me like a ton of bricks. Not just for its sonic experimentation where you will stack the album with some hard-won anthemic cuts, but writing that knows precisely where to cut weary lines to the bone. There are some splashes of electronic elements and even a bit of auto-tune, but they complement a disordered, forward-thinking mind trying to put something back together. And the startling thing is that across the arc of the album, he does find new love and new happiness, but has to convince himself that he is worthy of it. That's why Dying Star has such a lasting impact for me. It's a project that hits the low points and shows every opportunity to keep blacking out and face planting, and every second guess you'll make in the throes of depression and substance abuse, but enough ragged breaths will be taken to ask forgiveness and just try to be better, and when you find love, the acceptance to be loved. And with Shape and Destroy this year, Rustin Kelly proved that he's got the goods to be a powerhouse for years to come. But at one specific moment, for me personally, this was special beyond words. I can't take that away. Number 18. The funny thing here is that for the longest time, I did not think this was her best. Maybe it was a part of me that didn't want it to be. Her debut was such a towering fusion of genres and styles and had so much narrative focus and charm that it had to be her best album this decade, not the more lightweight effort that was targeting the pop crossover, right?
So if the world should end tonight, I had a crazy classic life.
Janelle Monáe creates worlds that I want to live in, and this was her best world created to date. Her earlier sense of theatricality had been tempered into something that was more organic and personal, and even if her genius pedigree allows her to pull on so many folks in order to craft these sonic landscapes, this is an album that is sculpted by a vision that feels impeccably hers. It's the next update to her brand of Afrofuturism, feminist and queer, and coaxed through sandy, luscious textures to cultivate its opulence, but not forgetting that scrappier core that lends all the touches of rock all the more bite, knowing the past but looking to the future. It's a vision of what America could be shaped to encompass by a singular architect who is a better singer and rapper and multi-instrumentalist than so many of her peers, and it's also her most loose, genuinely fun, and ridiculously catchy album to date. She's always been ahead of her time, folks, and I'll say it, Prince would have been proud. Number 17. So I've said a number of times that there are albums I wish felt less relevant given their subject matter this year. This is one that somehow only ramped up in its intensity, and thank God the bangers still connected with all that nervous rage across the way, because all throughout this summer, I needed this.
Where you at? Where you at? Where you at? If it ain't moving us, then it need to
This is about the purest distillation of what bruising anti-fascist music can be in the past couple of years. All killer, no filler. 7 cutthroat bangers where the apocalypse or authoritarianism is inevitable, but the plan is just, you gotta survive, you gotta keep fighting. The chemistry that Sims and POS here, they have a sort of rap rock ricochet that might have been implied on their debut in 2017, but is razor focused here, with production stripped back to the jagged percussion, the driving bass, and a fractured clatter of melody that is all you need. And the content doesn't shy away from actually being aggressive and goading provocation. Not just in the breathing moments that you have to live like this, but also resist with a gloved fist. It has to stay on the offensive, because the cost of letting down one's guard in today's day and age, that's far worse. I'm really grateful that it seems like Sims is the larger architect of this, for reasons I've already mentioned about POS, who does get outshone here yet again. But along the way, they made what might be one of the most dangerous and punk albums of the 2010s, even if the sound doesn't quite match the typical archetype. And almost the best team-up of a duo of veteran heavy hitters. We'll get to the other one in a little bit. Number 16. I've mentioned a few times that I found projects that have made this list by accident, and yeah, this might be the goddamn poster child, found on Pitchfork by accident in a review that didn't even get Best New Music, and yet revealed as one of the best new singer-songwriters this decade. Let's talk about him one more time.
Lady of Paak, I think I found a part. I think I found a piece of what you used to be. Dozing in the back of a funeral car and tangled in the blankets of your memories.
Ultimately, Dolls of Highland rises above Full Circle Nightmare for me on production and the individual songs. It's the grimier, rougher listen that belies the eclectic instrumental choices, and just how much of it Kyle Craft recorded in his laundry room, but that texture adds so much to his guttural howls and painting his tattered gothic scenes, just as soaked in a genre mishmash of retro glam rock, but with a devilish eye for progressive southern charm. Again, it's such an utterly unique listen in its sound, and when you factor in such well-paced and structured poetry for an eye for all that incisive detail, and the hooks that stack up for days, seriously, the run from Balmaria to Gloom Girl is something to behold. Kyle Craft proved to the world that this could be his stage with this debut, and at his age, with as much talent as he has, future is bright indeed. Number 15. So there are albums on this list that have felt more relevant with every passing year, already touched on this, and some of that is just a matter of circumstance. Times change or get better or worse, and certain projects might pick up additional resonance. It happens. I can't help but feel that this one was so far ahead of the curve that folks are only now starting to catch up, but its ominous echo will persist regardless.
Looking back for the rest of mine. Get up like I never fucking got it before. And I get it like I never fucking got it before.
The collective all hunkered down in a remote cabin in the middle of nowhere and made their most frigid, inhospitable album to date, and in my opinion, it's their best. The production, for one, it's not just huge and alien and menacing, but it can also capture that careening, wild desperation that permeates every single bar, the apocalyptic art that persists in any underground that's willing to take it in, twisted in its braggadocious, raw edge that lets them stack up hooks for days, but also conscious of when overstressed or corrupt systems collapse, either by their own hands or the breakdown of society, well, a group has to band together to sift through whatever's left of the rubble. You're not going to be able to do it on your own. It is a harrowing listen. The group, they do need each other to survive, and that connection will be tested viciously, and their own personal idiosyncrasies will splash to the forefront, where voices might seem to run together until you pick up all those distinctive bites and flips that set them apart. Well, except for Dessa, but we'll get to her later on. But in the meantime, even if Doomtree's future is suspect going forward for a lot of unfortunate and infuriating reasons, this is where the sum overcomes the sins of one. And it kicks ass. Number 14. Funnily enough, this next project also focuses on sin, not in real life as far as I've known, but the omnipresence of it, where the focus is on how hard it is to be a good person and how wearisome that long, lonely path can be, especially in the aftermath of a breakup that was probably long in coming. Thankfully, we got one of the best writers in country music in order to sketch out that balance.
And there ain't no conversation between the daylight and the dark. It's a worn out situation when you don't know where you are.
Okay, quick mention that, like with Temple of Thought, this is another album that I don't think ends particularly all that well. Kind of a bit of a sour note with that collaboration that doesn't quite match the tone of the project. A problem, but not a deal breaker. But I only bring that up because damn near front to back, Jason Eady wrote a post-breakup album that might just be his best work. Spare, with just enough acoustic texture to accentuate all that loneliness. Not an album that needs to suffocate in brooding, but one that picks up the very weary maturity of adults making bad decisions because they haven't quite processed pain the way they should have. It's a thing. The sort of framing that only judges as much as he will judge himself. I still hold the title track as the best walk of shame song that's likely ever been written, and by far the best version of Chris Stapleton's Whiskey and You is on this album, and the fact that damn near 3/4 of the project could be country staples in any other circumstance. But that's the gravitas of this project. There is this purity in a country format in songwriting that you get from Jason Eady that isn't backwards looking, coming from tradition but not anchored to it. You could have found this album in any era and would have been just as devastating regardless. I was hesitant to say this 6 years ago, but I'm going to say it now. This is Jason Eady's best album, well, at least until he tops it. And he is one guy who could probably pull that off. We'll have to see. But in the meantime, this is here. Number 13. Let's inject a little bit more levity into this. There's been some really heavy projects on this list. Let's talk about the absurd, the ridiculous, the love-struck, the high romanticism. Can't you tell I'm just listing synonyms on this project here?
And nothing will be spared, but I love you, honey bear.
You know, I think I'm still a little bit annoyed he didn't play more of this album when I actually saw him live in 2016, but okay, different conversation. So, remember when I referenced Elvi a while back and talking about taking the piss out of white indie rock dudes? Most of Josh Tillman's shtick is doing something very similar, where you can't quite tell whether or not he's being entirely ironic or sincere, especially as he leans into the warmer tones of 70s AM singer-songwriters with that fantastic voice of his. But that's the genius of this album. Yeah, the love story of the project is completely absurd, mostly toxic, showing a partner who is just as much of a bullshitting phony as Josh Tillman is, and there is a certain wild performativity in their romance that is clearly taking all of the piss. It's like you're watching a great episode of You're the Worst, where both partners seem to revel in being just so shamelessly shitty dicks to everyone else around and a society that they keep trying to castigate. But I'm gonna repeat something I have said many a time. What folks often say ironically is something they might truly believe unironically. And as the album proceeds, the intimacy that's cultivated in this love story begins to coalesce into maybe something more, and the rituals of romance and family down that pipeline begin to hold a value to them they might not even believe was possible. Hell, maybe love just is an economy based on mutual scarcity. But what's that got to do with you and me? And when you factor in that flicker of reality that grounds it all, even despite the absurdly florid writing, yeah, it's a hipster love story, but it's a goddamn great one. Pure comedy might have been the project where you can clearly tell Josh Tillman was trying to make all those grand statements of purpose, or at least deconstruct some of those statements in glorious fashion. But this is the masterpiece he kind of stumbled into by accident, and it's all the better for it. Number 12. I remember the first time I heard this album. It was frigid, it was cold. I think I was running errands before Christmas trying to go through her back catalog in the meantime to cover the newest release, and I realized I could not focus on anything else I was doing as the talent and writing literally had stolen all of my attention away.
I don't need to know, but I'd put on my best fresh little black dress and go get seen tonight. Work on that alibi of yours.
Dessa's debut album is so self-assured, so literate in its reference points, so undeniably focused in its precocious blend of braggadocious swagger that you would expect from somebody coming from the Doomtree crew, but also the messy reality of being a woman in an underground scene that doesn't know what to do with them when they're behind the mic, let alone value them. Honestly, it kind of blows my mind to consider it as a solo debut, because Dessa is operating on a level of wordplay and delivery that blows past just so many who are just starting, especially with the confidence to step into some jazzier slices of R&B to coax out her own hooks amidst a production palette that reflects the tension between her crew's bruising intensity and a more elegant, very feminine touch. It's another point of tension that Dessa's self-awareness means it does surface, but she's also looking to untangle the very human psychology wrapped around all of it, gender roles included and be damned. And yet if you think it's all just coffee house wordplay, she's got the hooks, a legit smolder in her delivery, and enough heartfelt moments to both entice and challenge listeners. There's that much charisma that's on display. This was the album that convinced me I had to hear more from this Doomtree crew, and as an entry point, so damn rewarding, it's held up to this day. Number 11. Of course, the power of a badly broken code is that it contains multitudes. A mature but tempestuous album where a lot of that storm had to be buried to survive. So what would happen if the songwriter stopped choosing to bury the storm, chose to unleash hell instead?
Baby, I'm afraid, but it's not your fault. Maybe I should go home alone tonight.
I struggle to say whether or not this is Nico Case's best album. I mean, it's up there, don't get me wrong, but she also has Blacklisted and Fox Confessor Brings the Flood, which are 2000s classics in my books. Many people would argue her 2013 album, The Worst Things Get, etc., is the more accessible listen, but it's always a little tepid and hemmed in for me. It never quite worked. Whereas Hell On is not. I made comparisons to Fiona Apple's Fetch the Bolt Cutters when I reviewed that album, but Hell On hasn't so much escaped the room as it just destroys the countryside in its wake. The writing is just as literate and emotionally charged, but the hooks are on a different level of gripping, even as the music around her gets more jagged and unstable and off-kilter in its grooves and melodies. But it's not a project that loses track of that humanity. A lot of old, tenuous connections that have shaped and tarnished her, but is the reconciliation with those moments and a progression that goes forward that gives the framing such impeccable human balance. Not so much a power fantasy, but power taken and realized and released. Hey, we love you better when you're wild. Suits you better, if we say so. I mean, this is an album that stirs the spirit with the same sort of divine feminine you would get from a Kate Bush album at her peak. And if that's not the highest praise, I don't know what is. This album is tremendously ignored. It shouldn't be. Number 10. Well, it's about time to get to this guy. Given how much I'm a pretty obvious fan, I think some people might be surprised it took this long. But he's a figure in his own way that's just as primal as Nico Case. Where her focus contains the storm, his contains all the negative space around it all. Especially here.
Who was it? Yeah, you know we real cool. On the far side of the morning, who was it? Yeah, you know we real cool.
This album, it's breathtaking. Not just in the fact that Nick Cave stripped it all away coming out of the 2000s and deconstructed so much of the wild rock of the previous decade for more unsteady grooves, more nervous touches of strings, and some ominous guitar work, but how his presence on the album takes shape. Never has his brand of apocalypse prophet held as much weight, but the uncanny power of Push the Sky Away isn't just the abstract weight and the bloody scenes that he paints in his words, but how they're delivered, a question of their impact, everything left unsaid. There's a surrealist but very human tension to the scenes that Nick Cave builds that comes with that unknowable emptiness. When you finish an idea or let a person fall out of your life, where does all that missed potential go? Especially as the album's centerpiece, Higgs Boson Blues, shows the very real trauma that can be unleashed with the loss of faith in the face of information that could well stand to be true. But it's also why I don't think the whole apocalypse prophet branding is all that true for Nick Cave here as well, because he doesn't shy away from getting kind of meta and showing how these very human fears and anxieties do impact him too. His baritone might be a stabilizing force in the mix, until it's revealed how unstable it really is. But hey, there's something in all of us that's always there, that strives to keep pushing, not succumb to the unknown emptiness. And paradoxically, that struggle brings a note of peace. Now, with an artist like Nick Cave, I cannot in good faith say this is his best album, nor the easiest jump on point, especially this decade, but we'll get to that all in good time. Number 9. You ever stumble across an album almost by accident, and you just know from the first few listens that not only is there a wealth of shining potential, but the artist has the poise, the eye for detail to deliver upon it all in spades, and yet so very few people know that she can deliver? Yeah, let's fix some of that, shall we?
All the memories are sweet, but I wouldn't trade them for the way we fight a little less now, make love a little more. Like that bottle we've been saving of California wine. We keep getting better with time.
I mean, look, it was just last year when I spoke a ton of high praise for Emily Scott Robinson, and I meant every word of it. Her eye for detail and production, her desire to take real risks in her compositions to tread into some fascinating territory that does push country sound while knowing the value of its foundation, a voice that knows her strengths and weaknesses, and as such has such authentic sweetness and vibrancy to it, and content that can paint with such detail for both darkness and light. I have not put any projects on this list because of pure potential going forward, but what I adore about Traveling Mercies is that the breadth of storytelling is fantastic, even before the factor of her potential comes into play. I would say it's the best indie country I've heard in recent years, but again, we got a few more spots on this list, so I can only hope that the richness of her journeys bears forth another bountiful harvest. Number 8. I just know this is going to be the most controversial entry on my list, and that would say a lot given that Kesha's on here twice, but this is different. This is a project that outside of its genre niche, I doubt many mainstream critics would have given it the time of day, as this was a band that would get laughed out of the room in the early 2000s by those who weren't in the know, let alone now. But in 2011, symphonic metal hit another apex, with 2 triumphs from the big 2 in the genre, and I already mentioned the first with the Unforgiving by Within Temptation. That was an honorable mention. This, the other one, on a different level. I'm going to take another controversial point of view that when Tarja Turunen left Nightwish for Annette Olsen, something changed within the band, something shifted. They got bigger, looser, wilder, and their hooks somehow reached another apex, and they were great to begin with. They were no longer just another symphonic metal band that was nudged out of frame in the mainstream. They were free to fly into whatever twisted weirdness Tuomas Holopainen would craft. And while 2007's Dark Passion Play was the transition, Imaginarum was the band at their greatest height. And unlike a few of these entries where many would say this could just be a musical in its own right, to me, this is more a concept album than anything else. Tuomas actually wanted to ensure that the project could stand alone outside of the film that they produced using music from this project, and wow, that was a great decision. I'm happy he kept that in mind. Now, granted, given how much fluttery dream logic has coaxed through all the wild shifts in genre and tone across this album, you could argue it would fit regardless. Seriously, there are songs that are inspired by smooth jazz, folk metal, doom metal, a nightmarish carnival spook house, and probably the closest thing that we could get to acoustic pop that Nightwish has ever been. But what's so stunning is how well it all works. Not just the instrumentation and production, which is lush and glorious, but the transitions and crescendos are among their best. One of their heaviest albums, one that uses the darker elements to intensify the melodic swell, and even if it all circles back to two of us making yet another album about the vast realms of imagination contained within the childlike dreams of the tortured artist, as he is wont to do, this is the closest he's ever come to capturing that immensity. Every kink from Dark Passion Play is ironed out and refined, and Nightwish, they set a bar for the decade that no band has come consistently close to passing in their genre. This is an album that earns epic as a descriptor, and not too many have given themselves the chance to be awed by it. Number 7. But on the flip side of all that, as much as I might praise a symphonic metal act for sensory overload, sometimes stripping everything back, even the genre from whence you came, that's where you find the most emotional clarity. And again, this is a personal choice for me. A particularly bad breakup in the late summer of 2016 before I took a trip overseas. You might have seen some of it in certain videos. And this album hit a very specific point of poignancy that might just stick with me for the rest of my life. In other words, she made it seem real.
I know just how it feels when you make it seem real.
This is the first moment where it felt like all the rails came off for Lydia Loveless and for her growth as an artist, as she tells the story of falling out of love really hard and then maybe even falling back in, where her rock bottom had her dancing up to the face of God, only for God to turn away. And she was on the whole rollicking proto-disco side of country before so many else dared to try it. But while the best descriptor of this album is alternative country, it is a singularly unique record. It's got some of that old scuzzy punk edge of her earlier work, but it's also more earnest and love-struck, and it's got some of that cleaner refinement, which of course only adds to the acid of the sharpest scenes here. And again, the framing is what gives this album so much power. It's so distinctly, intimately human with its wealth of details that you got no choice but for the framing just to give everyone quarter. Even the Midwestern guys Lydia Loveless might chide. But again, for as dark as it gets in its most venial moments, it ends on hope, where there's enough effort put forward to just keep on trying. As of yet, she just dropped a new album that I have not heard at time of this recording, so I won't say for certain this is her best, but I will say this struck such a point of resonance for me, I'll never forget it. Number 6. I mean, on some level, we knew this was coming, just a matter of getting there.
Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them, fuck the slow-mo.
I can make the argument this is the best thing that Killer Mike and LP have ever done, both on their own and together. The writing, the trade-off of bars between them is masterful. The production is leaner and rougher and borderline punk rock in many edges. But what's tempered of their braggadocious edge of their debut something into a lot more furious and cutting. It moved a lot of the politics that was just hinted at on Run the Jewels 1 to the forefront here. And again, it's one of those albums that feels way more resonant and prescient and relevant than I would like it to feel. But there's something intangible about this album that puts it in a different tier for me in comparison with the other Run the Jewels albums. A distinctive hunger that's galvanized not just from kickstarting something new or a comfort from knowing your lane and what works for you, but then burning your way into uncharted territory with flamethrowers and machetes. But for as much unquenched rage runs through this project, and man, it's righteous, there's also more diversity that's often given credit. There's a great smoldering sex jam with Gangsta Boo, plenty of riotous bangers that are so easy to add as staples to their catalog, horror-fronting confrontation with police on Early that feels painfully real and unmistakably grounding in an era of rampant and systemic police brutality. But then we get Crown, The song where Killer Mike doesn't just confront his old drug dealer past, but where LP tries to get inside the groupthink, the militant attitude of cops as a message to break their own internal chains and conditioning. Again, it's an album with this much daring firepower and from legit veterans. I mean, the vast majority of people seem to agree this album was the true breakthrough in 2014, but in my opinion, it remains their best. Number 5. Well, yeah, I think you all knew this was coming. You've waited long enough.
Well, I've been deep in this sleeplessness, I don't know why. Just can't get away from myself. When I get back on my feet, I'll blow this open wide and carry me home in good health.
This is the best rock album of the 2010s, and I'm still a little bit amazed how few people outside of Canada have seemed to realize it, at least for me. And while I have been the evangelist for this band for coming up on a decade now, Astoria is a concept album calling back to the classic rock roots of The Who and Queen, with instrumentals and production that have that glorious impact of a different time, but all the polish and rollicking charm of modern pop rock. And as such, so much of it I gotta lay at the feet of Josh Ramsey, their frontman, who is not only a singer who can run the vast majority of his competition out of the goddamn building with one of the most powerful voices and excellent falsettos working today, but also as a producer and a songwriter who can craft and arrange such a powerhouse. And for such a concept album, it would be so easy to get swallowed up in its own immensity, but Mariana's Trench makes it a pretty by-the-numbers breakup album, when on the surface at least, in order to keep that humanity very grounded, especially when it's not just about the messy fractures, but what happens when a lot of the art you've written around for the past decade circles this longtime partner and companion, and then when she comes back wanting to try again, how in the nine hells are you going to process and contextualize that weight and desperately hoping against hope that it might work? And look, I'm not going to say you have to be a diehard Mariana's Trench fan to get the full impact that so much of the weight transcends the project when fully contextualized anyway, even as it works wonderfully self-contained, but again, with impeccable framing that holds his melodramatic ass to the fire as much as anyone's, but still lets you tap into all that wild, barely controlled energy, with every single interlude reinforcing melodic motifs and somehow feeling essential to the lengthy experience, and how the hooks are stacked so high, I'd argue there's only a single good but not great song on the album. This was very nearly my first perfect score I gave in a review, but you know what? Let's talk about the 4 albums that actually hit that height. Number 4. So one thing I hope you all realize about this list is that as much as there is an order, I dearly love everything I'm talking about, and I really hope you don't get that bent out of shape by how I've ordered them, as this has been fluctuating for the past 6 months that I've been struggling to assemble this list, and it's probably going to fluctuate after I finish recording this, because of course it will. But getting to these releases, these are albums in which I can't even find minor flaws. Or if they do have them, they're overcome by the sheer wealth of greatness, and on any other album, the lesser songs would still stand out as the best. I don't bring up the word perfection when it comes to giving a 10 out of 10 to an album, because, again, no object standard of perfection in art, but I've already talked about 3 of these albums at length in the reviews, and we do need to talk about the one for which I haven't. And as such, if I were to pick a crowning jewel in an artist's discography,
and burning pieces on the ground, we watch it fall. Maybe love is rocket science after
this is one of those country folk albums that is so consistently amazing from front to back in its writing and framing that it's kind of tough to know where to start describing it. Because on the surface, It's not an album that asserts its presence or its greatness. It's country folk that can cultivate atmosphere by letting some guitars smolder in a pretty bare mix, but it's not showy about it, which is why I disagree with anybody who calls this album more sentimental. I mean, it's way too grounded and normal sounding in its composition and production to try to coax out that emotionality or that sentimentality. Indeed, that's where I think Lorraine has so much weight. Dave Cobb understood Lori McKenna's uniquely rough vocal delivery and stunning writing would make for enough that he made a show of adding a little ornamentation or a very spare backdrop in order to accentuate it, whereas this album doesn't feel the need for any sort of theatricality. And that's why when you read into the content, it almost catches you off guard how raw and incisive it feels, especially in comparison with Lori McKenna's major label albums in the 2000s that came ahead of it, Bitter Town and Unglamorous, the former of which I will still argue is a classic, but this is on a different level. Those are albums that had some form of artistic deflection by necessity. Lorraine, it's an album that can't deflect, and doesn't try to. The comparison that sprung to mind to me is A Crow Looked at Me by Mount Eerie, and that's why I understand that album's weight without quite connecting to it, because for me, this is the album for which it does in a similar way. And a lot of the scenes Lori McKenna paints are small, they're family-oriented, they're populous to a fault but not trying to be. She captures the little emotions of love that's unrequited from a partner, or of a loss in the family, of memories big and small she's assigned more weight than they need or is healthy, of dreams you've had to put aside and leave behind, of reaching a moment of clarity when endings have to come and you're left behind. And there's a fair amount of faith and folksy wisdom. It's Lori McKenna, of course you're gonna get it. But where Casey Musgraves might treat some of it with subversion at her best, Lori McKenna knows that to many, and to herself despite herself, it's a lifeline, especially as the album does not end with much relief. A quiet mini arc across the album is the loss of her mother and the heavy weight of expectations within her family she's struggling to parse as a woman in her mid-40s, and by the end, she imagines her mom going to heaven and finding that relief for which she hasn't quite attained, still down on the ground below. I'm going to say this is an album that went overlooked by pretty much everyone except for an extremely limited number who know of Lori McKenna, but it's a project so directly universal and plain-spoken in its expression, that's why it sticks. And it's also why I think she's one of the best writers of this decade, plain and simple. I mean, you know, like she'd want it to be. Number 3. Next is another heavy one I reviewed, and one that actually got some controversy at the time because it was also surrounding a death, and there was some backlash to critics and saying, oh, you know what, you're only scoring this as high as you are because his son died in a tragic accident not that long, but now 4 years later, nah, I'm comfortable calling this one like I hear it.
They told us our gods would outlive us, but they lie.
The power of this album was never just rooted in its events. That's the thing I think a lot of people don't get. That does a massive disservice to how Nick Cave had to assemble this, with some of his most forward-thinking and fractured electronics and grooves that he's ever touched. There's still real experimentation here. All the sweeping space of Push the Sky Away collapsed into a fractured, broken hall where the decay is real, and as much as his voice might call, it goes unbidden. And while there is a performance going on here, it's not trying for spare restraint or to speak purely as human, but as someone who has always felt larger than life in his music and has framed himself like that, but is now cast down to the brutal reality. And it's not just that loss, but something deeper. For a storyteller, especially one who has danced with death way too many times, this is where the narrative itself fails Nick Cave. So abstraction collides with the very real and raw emotions of reality. And not only does he have to keep on living, he has to try and salve some of the pain for his wife and family that have left behind. And as such, the grief is uncomfortable and raw and altogether too close, but bound into a frail thematic construct with just enough deflection that it can be taken, but also still touch you. I mean, between the beautiful female vocals and Nick Cave's cracking delivery, and my god, those strings. I'm not sure to this day I can listen to Distant Sky in public. It is that moving. But again, it is a project that somehow ends with hope. You know what, maybe not hope so much as them fiddling with an attempt at normality and trying to see through the static and whatever might come next. Or to put it another way, in my opinion, Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds have made two 10 out of 10 classic albums in his canon. One is 1990's The Good Son, the other is this. I mean, I don't think he cared that this experiment worked in the path that he took towards healing, but there is a wonder that it actually did. Number 2. I think if you follow my channel, you knew this was coming. You might disagree fervently, she's a bit of an acquired taste after all, but to me, when an artist assembles a work of such intricacy and interweaving layers that only find more sparks of transcendence with every single listen, look folks, in the music of the spheres, that's where you will hear the chime.
The camera's running. And red eyes shining in the camera flash. My secret is I don't keep on. See something, go ahead and say something. I ain't afraid of it. I don't drown, won't stay down. He finds a way to rise somehow. Skin the crowd is coming out, and I don't see too many rivals now.
I don't think a lot of folks knew how to properly gauge Dessa's magnum opus in the 2010s, and that makes a lot of sense because it's not a conventional album that adheres to any set genre. Most of the time I'd call it rap, but about half of it is R&B and indie pop and flying off into weird fluttery directions that are beautifully produced and make the best use of her unconventional but expressive style. She's not a great singer, but she doesn't need to be. Her lilting delivery can capture that low-key magic in so many moments while still conveying a lot of real emotion. And while I'll rave about all of her rap songs that are packed to the gills with the sort of primal intensity that will challenge all comers, the larger truth is that beyond that, this album is a challenge to feminine expression itself. This is a project that sees power structures in tatters and even more fire on the horizon, and begins asking the hard questions of femininity and how it's defined, both within and without sexuality. Partially because she aspires to more, but also because she needs answers for herself if she's gonna keep on living within those power structures. That's what gives this album so much uncomfortable complexity. It challenges a lot of feminist expectations and then dares them and herself to see the consequences of living within them or challenging them and going further. And hell, I'd argue it does go further on songs like Say When, where she'll challenge all the power structures and ascend to the top, but be alone. She wins again, but she sounds heartbroken. And that heartbreak is a quintessential touch on the album. Behind the scenes, much of this project was written while she was taking a study, trying to purge old feelings of love she had toward an abusive asshole that's already been mentioned a few too many times on this list, unfortunately. And she was doing so with experimental neurofeedback therapy, and that feeds into a messy conversation of how love's entanglements feed into those power structures themselves. This album that is quite literally, it contains multitudes, and more I find with every listen, but it's also deeply romantic, pretty damn funny, heartbreaking in its choice moments, and has bangers to boot. Only one project this decade felt as varied and as powerful as this is. Number 1. It feels kind of strange that this is my top album of the 2010s. Because on some level it's a compilation assembled by one producer who at this point must be the best connected man working in indie country, and you've heard his name countless times on this list. And it feels weird to have a compilation be that project. It drove me crazy whenever I saw compilations show up on Rolling Stone's new 500 best albums of all time list, because you would think an album would be required to say more, be more than just a collection of songs. But Dave Cobb, he made more than just a collection of songs. He made a masterpiece.
That's alright, that's alright, that's alright, that's alright. Since my soul's got a seat up in the kingdom, that's alright.
To this day, there's a part of me that thinks this can't exist. If only because the supporting cast behind it all showed up and delivered their A-game in spades. And look at this cast. John Paul White, Jason Isbell, Brent Cobb, Miranda Lambert, Chris and Morgan Stapleton, Zach Brown, Jamie Johnson, Anderson East, Holly Williams, Brandy Clark, Shooter Jennings. My God, this list is stacked. But again, if it was just a compilation of great, well-produced country songs that doesn't have a single miss among them, that would be one thing. But Southern Family is actually way more ambitious than that, because it demands not just the artist confront the hard realities of such a family down in the South, fractures and pain and everything in between, but also the inevitability of deaths in those families that will break everything apart. The album opens with the line, "You're gonna die, you're gonna die." And the project has to grapple with that force and the very real flawed society beneath it that tries to keep everyone together at its core, which is a losing battle in life and one that shows its marks on everyone. You get the tempered machismo of Anderson East against blasts of Muscle Shoals horns, or the subtle ricketing rustle from Brent Cobb. You get the honest homespun grief of Zach Brown that might be a little more sentimental, to the more raw moments from Brandy Clark that balance it out. From Jason Isbell's wry conversations between preachers and thieves, to the Miranda Lambert trying to buy into a fragment of that wisdom, and Jamie Johnson showing those who can't buy in. But the album's most powerful moment is when it ends, taking the road against the peals of Rich Robinson's guitar, and a black Southern gospel choir adds the raw power to tie it all together. They are the linchpin of this project, and the rejoinder to John Paul White's opening lines, "If you're gonna die, you got a seat in that kingdom at the end, and it'll be okay, whatever that might lead." I mean, I can go on about how distinctive and varied and beautifully produced the album is, how there's so much emotional complexity and power interwoven from every single voice, how the writing often brings together so many little details and nuggets that you can imagine they're all just one huge family with so many different perspectives on the same table, or just the spread of them all. But to me, it's my top album of the 2010s. It transcends them all. Bring on the next decade, people. Hopefully I'll be more ahead of the game and on top of things next time. I really do hope so. But hey, if you stuck around this long, why don't you like and subscribe? I'd be extremely grateful. And hey, after this was my biggest project of this year. We got some big stuff on the horizon. Hope you all stick around. Leave your comments with what you think your list of the 2010s would be, even though it's probably pretty layered. But until then, I'm Mark. You're watching Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.